All right, guys, welcome to the stream today. Apologies, last week we did not get in our second stream of the week. Hopefully we'll get two streams in this week, but I'm not sure yet. And again, apologies for the kind of schedule breakup, but I want to give you a little bit of a behind the scenes of what's going on at SAI and at Church Disrupted. Before we get into the stream today, before we get into the content. One, just so you know, but two, I actually want to ask for your prayers. I don't ask for your prayers very often, but we are in a very busy, very good, but very busy and very hard season. So, really, this past month and probably the rest of the next month, we're in one of our busiest seasons because we're about to launch the biggest project that we have ever done. You're going to see it next week for episode 100 of the podcast. Okay. Episode 100 of the podcast, we are going to be launching the absolute biggest project we've ever done. I believe this is going to be a shot across the bow that helps change church culture, not just in the United States, but all across the world, because it is going to give you the power to shine a light on what's going on in your churches and to see when other people shine a light on what's going on in churches. It is going to provide transparency in a way that I've never seen another tool do in regards to NDAs. All right. So only you guys on the live stream have really heard a ton about that, but that's coming. We're actually going to introduce that for episode 100 with a panel of pastors. Okay. But when you hear what we're doing, when you hear about that project next week, okay, what you're going to notice is you're going to say, okay, that took a lot of work. And to get this to the finish line, it's taking a lot of work. So that's one of the things that is taking some bandwidth right now. Also, we are starting a brand new fundraising initiative that we haven't talked a lot about. It's kind of a local fundraising initiative, but we have a huge fundraising event this weekend, but we've got events all throughout the fall, but they're very heavy in September. Probably our biggest fundraising event of the fall is actually going to be happening this weekend. So at the same time as the NDA project, that is really, really difficult. And for those of you that are asking, why did you plan it that way? The reality is we wanted to launch this NDA project months ago, but because of some of the legal hurdles that we have had to kind of, jump through a lot of different discussions to try to make sure, in all honesty, to try to make sure we're trying to be above reproach, and that it's just that we're not making it easy for churches to sue us just because they get mad. Okay. Because to be able to do the thing that we're going to do with this project, it is going to make people, it's going to make some church leaders very uncomfortable. It's going to make some church people very uncomfortable. And there's a reason why nobody else has done it. And that just pushed this project back. So we got these things kind of moving next to each other. And then on top of that, episode 100, trying to do something special for that. So all of those things are just kind of coming together. And then there's some unexpected things on the back end. We're getting to do some really good work. I was on a conversation today with a pastor who is saying, hey, I got an allegation. I'm trying to figure out how to handle this allegation. I want to do this the right way. I want to learn. And guys, those are really hard conversations, really long conversations, really unexpected conversations. But I'm so grateful to get to be a part of them, and that pastors are starting to reach out. And instead of trying to hide things, to say, hey, help me understand this, help me navigate really, really tough situations. So anyway, that's kind of just the whirlwind that's going on at SAI right now. And then on top of that, this week, Friday is actually, so Thursday, we're going to be recording episode 100. I want to do it live with you on the normal live, but that's why I said I'm not sure we're going to be able to do a live. If we do it live, it will probably be pushed to Friday this week. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to make it work, but I'm going to try. But Thursday, the only time I was able to get with these pastors to do this pastors live panel for episode 100 was actually during the time that we normally live stream. Okay. So we're doing that on Thursday, but then on Friday morning, we have a board meeting for this quarter for Q3. And this is where I need the board's help in order to be able to get episode 100 live, in order to be able to make this project go. I've got to get their input. We've got to approve some things. I've got to get their votes on everything. So fingers crossed, God willing, that's what we're going to do. And if for any reason we can't, and the board is not ready to move forward on that, then we'll just pivot and we'll punt. Okay. But that's probably the biggest board meeting that we have ever had, just making sure that we're all feeling really good about where we're going, and that we're getting all the I's dotted and the T's crossed. So that is just a lot at one time. So I apologize. Schedule was off last week. Schedule will be off this week. Hopefully next week we will be back to a normal schedule. But for the next month, it is going to continue to be really, really busy around here. And just, I always want to be honest with you guys. So to be completely candid, as honest as I can be, guys, I am tired, and I'm a little beat up over the last couple of weeks. Everything is good, but I would covet your prayers, just to be able to navigate this season and do it really, really well, because these are all very important things. But I'm exhausted, and looking forward to a trip in October to be able to take a break. But we're working on plans for you guys so that you have content coming out that week as well. So again, guys, I would really covet your prayers. If you are a praying person, would you remember me, and would you remember SAI in your prayers? Just because it's a heavy season, right? There's nothing wrong, there's nothing bad. It's just really, really heavy. And I've told you guys before, sometimes this stuff, the stuff that we talk about, it's important. We have to do it. But there are some weeks where I'm just like, man, I feel like it's getting on me. I wish I could take a break. But the work still needs to be done. And God is doing a lot of amazing things, I believe, through this work. Even the fact that we've got a panel of pastors who are willing to have this conversation with us, for episode 100 is fantastic. So again, if you're a praying person, please, please, please pray for us over the next few weeks. And then I want to ask for your help practically before we jump in as well. If you guys, let me go ahead and see if I can share my screen here. We're in kind of the back end of what's called the summer slump on YouTube. If you're not familiar with what that is, kind of the summer months are just really hard. We had a pretty decent summer, but August and September has just kind of, man, all the air's been sucked out of it. Less people are on YouTube. It's harder to get people to watch things, yet we're doing some very important things like episode 100, and I want people to see that. And our views the last couple of weeks have been just way, way off. I know that's the YouTube stuff, but I do want to ask for your help practically. If you haven't watched one of our either of our last two videos, we dropped episode 99 today, which was a podcast episode with Ruslan. Again, Ruslan's actually got a book release today. And we took kind of the topic. He talks about his book, but talked about it in a very different direction, a very deep direction. I teared up in the first 7 minutes of the interview. It's very vulnerable. We talk about just kind of the insidiousness of selfish ambition, and just, man, this idea of what success is in the church today, how it leads to spiritual abuse. It's a 90-minute conversation. I don't know why it says on there, it said all day, like 2 hours and 23 minutes. It's actually a 90-minute conversation, a little bit shorter of an episode for us. But it's a fantastic episode. We talk about a lot of different things. So I was grateful for Ruslan coming on to talk about that for episode 99. It just launched today. But last week's episode is one I've been wanting to put out for a long time. It is so good to help you think about Scripture differently, thinking about the role that Scripture plays when it's manipulated in spiritual abuse. We had Marty Solomon from the Bema podcast on with us. And guys, again, it's just that time of year where views kind of tank, and not a lot of people have seen that. So if you haven't watched either of those two videos, would you help us out? Would you go watch it? Would you give it a like? Would you give it a comment? And just help anything that you see of ours, any way that you can support it and help boost it over the next couple of weeks, because I want to make sure that episode 100 next week, that we are able to get that in front of as many people as possible. So that's a practical way that you could help us out, because things have been a little wonky on the YouTube side, just because of the time of year that it is. So anyway, I appreciate you guys and appreciate all of your help, and just how involved you guys are. I love this community, and you're making a difference. You really are. You're making a difference, because we can't do this without you. We can't do this without our supporters, our watchers, our community, our donors. Everybody's playing a role. And guys, again, are just a really kind of just painful, hard conversation with a pastor who's walking through, today, just like, gosh, these allegations, I didn't do anything wrong, but I'm trying to handle this the right way. These are people that I love, talking about the Safe Church Pledge. It was just a good reminder that man, God is using this work. He is doing something. So thank you for the role that you are playing. And guys, I think you are going to be stoked when you hear what we're doing with this project for episode 100. So next week, we'll do that. And I will try my best. I think we're going to release that Tuesday, pretty early during the day. And I am going to try my best to actually be on live in that premiere, just kind of talking through it. And then we'll do our normal live stream later in the day. There's a chance that we move it to Monday. I'll try to put something out a little bit closer to time once we get it recorded, make sure the editing process is going. But I think you guys are going to be pumped. It's really good. But with that, let's jump in. Let's talk about where the live stream is going to go today. This one's probably not going to be very polished because I have been everywhere, and that's okay. But I think it's a conversation that we need to have. I had someone send me, early last week or maybe over the weekend with Labor Day holiday and all that. Um, but I had someone who sent me a news story about Pastor David Taylor. And if you don't know who David Taylor is, you will by the end of this live stream. But this guy basically got raided and is under indictment with the FBI for like human trafficking and exploitation. And it's not the kind of trafficking you're normally thinking of, right? But a very different kind of just forced labor ring, essentially. Like these are the things that we're talking about. But as wild as that sounds, and this is one of the craziest stories of spiritual abuse I've ever heard. As wild as it sounds, though, it's just a hop, a skip, and a jump from the volunteer exploitation that we talk about fairly regularly on the podcast, probably a couple times a year. We're talking about volunteer exploitation and how it's so easy for churches to move beyond having volunteers to exploiting volunteers if we're not careful. And the bigger your church gets, the more it runs off volunteers. And if we're not careful, we essentially use volunteers who want to please God, who want to be around the church, who want to have community. And we take that desire and we misuse it by not protecting them, not giving them any boundaries. And we essentially can use volunteers as an unpaid labor force that eventually takes a very negative toll on their faith. And guys, some of you are going to think this is hyperbole, but I hopefully I can show you it's not a huge leap from that kind of volunteer exploitation that a lot of people want to say is not a problem, that I would say is actually a big problem, to where this happened today. Okay. Because again, people want to please God and want to please their pastors. They want to please their church, and that can lead to the exploitation of people. So we're going to talk about what happened with David Taylor. We're going to talk about the fact that multiple people have been calling out warning signs and red flags of David Taylor for a long time. I've never been super familiar with him. I didn't really follow that ministry. I've heard some other things, but I haven't really done any videos on him because it's not something that's really in my purview. But we're going to look at some people who kind of called him out before. We're going to look at the red flags that led to this, why it's important that we catch them when they're just kind of early red flags before they turn into something crazy like this that just makes the church look bad, guys. Like this is not, as a Christian, as a church member, I don't want this stuff attached to my Jesus. I don't want this stuff attached to the body of Christ that I'm a part of, the gathering that I'm a part of. So we're going to look at that. But we're also, before we get done, we are going to hear, I'm going to react to a video of another podcaster and former pastor, former guest on the show. I'm kind of a polarizing figure as well at times. But we're going to listen to something that he said, I think before this came out, but it connects because he was sharing some conversations on his podcast about volunteer exploitation. And guys, every single time I talk about volunteer exploitation, I have Christians in the comments who are they are mad, they are butthurt, and they're just like, Jeff, you are just trying to trash the church. See, you're just trying to be against the church because, man, you call it volunteer exploitation. These are volunteers. They can leave at any time. It's no big deal. And I will have people get so mad when I talk about volunteer exploitation, acting like we are making a mountain out of a molehill. But after you hear this story, you're going to realize it's not making a mountain out of a molehill. It is saying, hey, do you realize there is a mountain growing, and that mountain is going to crush people under the weight of spiritual abuse if we don't do something about it. But I wanted to react to I wanted to react to this other podcaster because I believe it's just helpful for you guys to hear other voices besides mine as well. And it's refreshing to hear someone talking about this. But guys, here's kind of the problem. We hear some pastors talk about this. We don't hear many talk about this because these are the kind of the things that even a pastor that recognizes a problem, it's hard to talk about the problem in your system when you're in the system, when your livelihood comes from the system, because you also realize that if we don't have volunteers, the system doesn't run. So it's easier for people like me. It's easier for people like the guy we're going to react to. It's easier for people who have been in the system, are now out. Our livelihoods are not tied to it. How many people volunteer at my church has nothing to do with whether I can pay the bills or not. Okay. It is easier for us to talk about it. Okay. And the answer is not to have volunteers. The answer isn't ask for volunteers, but there are some easy answers, I think, for the church to protect volunteers, to protect our people. And again, make sure we're exhorting one another, we're edifying one another, we're discipling one another, we're helping each other grow, iron sharpening iron, but we're not using one another. We're not stepping over people. And that's a big part of our conversation, not volunteer exploitation, but stepping over people, sacrificing people on the altar of ministry and stepping over other people for success. That's a big part of our conversation with Ruslan on this week's episode of the podcast. So again, if you haven't checked that out, go check out at some point this week when you get a chance. Watch, give it a comment, help us boost it, that conversation with Ruslan. But also, if you didn't check it out, go back and watch Marty Solomon's interview last week. We got a lot of other content coming out, so we may not be able to make the live stream happen this week. But guys, I will do my very best after this week. We're going to try to get back to a much more sustainable schedule of the two live streams. But anyway, let's see what's going on in the comments, and then we'll jump in and we will talk about this stuff today. Thank you so much, Abby, for being here, for moderating with us. Thank you to Tracy for producing today as well. Appreciate you guys both. We are glad you're here, as Tracy said. Let us know where you're listening and watching from today. Always like to know that. It seems like our community is growing. We're getting people from different countries all the time, from all over the United States. It's going to be it's just really cool to see where all you guys are coming from. So Sherry says, I'm watching from Georgia. Appreciate you for watching, Sherry. Also, prayers for Jeff. Thank you, Sherry. I do appreciate that. I struggle asking for prayer sometimes, but I'm trying to get better at being vulnerable and just saying, hey, this is a hard season, because we all have hard seasons. So I appreciate you. Appreciate your prayers. Appreciate your encouragements. Elizabeth watching from Midland. Elizabeth, soon, you sent me some stuff that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about hopefully on the next live stream. I just got to finish parsing it, and this has been too crazy to get to it. So thank you for watching from North Carolina, but also thank you for the content that you have sent recently. If it's not the next one, it'll be one of the next few. So anyway, just wanted to let you know I haven't forgot about you. Susie Q is watching as well. Thank you guys so much for watching today. So let's go ahead and let's dive into this conversation around David Taylor, these raids, and all of this sort of stuff. This has got to be one of the wildest, craziest stories of spiritual abuse that I have ever heard. And guys, as a Christian, man, I don't want this attached to my Jesus or my church or the body of Christ that I belong to at all. If you haven't heard, there's a pastor who's a part of a ministry across multiple states, North Carolina, Florida, Texas, who calls himself an apostle, who has built this big multi-million-dollar ministry. And just in the last couple of weeks, there was an FBI raid on his homes, on his ministries. He's under indictment. And guys, it is for some really crazy things that you wouldn't normally associate in the church. We're talking about this guy having charges of fraud, of money laundering, of forced labor, of human trafficking, all while being a pastor, calling himself an apostle. And the worst part is he's been showing us red flags and showing us that something was wrong for a long time. And if we pay attention to red flags, we can protect people early. When we don't pay attention to red flags, it turns into, guys, not just spiritual abuse, not just a black eye for the church and bad news headlines. It turns into people being traumatized for life. And you're going to hear just some of the crazy stuff that these victims went through. And so we're going to talk about this story. We're going to talk about the wildness of it. We're going to try to get in our heads that this is a real thing, but we're going to talk about the red flags that we could have seen. And we're going to talk about how to avoid this kind of spiritual abuse and these kind of shenanigans in the church going forward, because I think there's some much smaller things that are happening in the church that if we would be very careful about as parishioners and as church leaders, we all have a role to play in this, where we could protect people and we could keep things like this from happening in the future. So let's go ahead and I'm going to share my screen. Let me go ahead and pull this up, and you can see the kind of headline there, right there at the top. Church leaders arrested in multi-million-dollar conspiracy after FBI raids. This feels like it's a TV show, like Breaking Bad meets the church kind of thing, okay? And I just want to send you the original news story that I had a friend send me about this. We're just going to kind of walk through this together and just talk about how in the world, how do we get here? Because again, guys, this is, I don't know any other word to say it. This is wild. This is almost unbelievable, but it's reality. So let's just kind of look through what happened.
Two church leaders with ties to Tampa are facing federal charges tonight. They're at the center of what investigators are calling a multi-million-dollar conspiracy involving money laundering, forced labor, and abuse. This follows multiple FBI raids this morning, including at a home in the affluent Avalon neighborhood in Hill.
All right. So again, guys, you see that home, you see all this stuff. You guys have heard some of my commentary on it, so it'll make sense a little bit more now. But you see this huge mansion. This is one of many mansions where this guy was living. Okay. He had compounds and mansions like this in Texas, in North Carolina, from what I understand, in Florida. This particular one was in Florida, and it was all paid for with ministry dollars. It was all paid for with ministry tithe dollars. People were sacrificially giving, and this is where the money was going. People were giving because they thought they were honoring God and they were honoring this apostle and they were expanding this ministry, and people were being reached. And what was really happening was this guy was buying mansions and he was buying cars and he was, doing all kinds of other shenanigans with this. But it's not just about the money. When you see that headline, church leaders accused of running a forced labor scheme, the FBI is actually going to call it, we'll see in an article later, they're going to call it human trafficking. Okay. These are really big, gross allegations that shouldn't be a part of the church. And it makes me sick that they are tied to a church. Okay. But that is what's going on. And it's just, it is hard to believe that this is a real news headline and that he was able to amass all these properties and do all these things and build this life of luxury. And none of us even knew. But the question is, should we have known?
Hillsborough County. This was part of a nationwide takedown. Fox 13 is covering this investigation from multiple angles.
All right, so that part, again, wanted to get back to it. When we had Nathan Apfel and Chris Ayub on, if you have not checked those things out, okay, we had them on over a year ago in a first video where we talked about the religion business documentary. We had them on in June as they released the religion business documentary. I'll try to link it in this description if I can remember, but it's in those video descriptions. It's also in our recap of the documentary, the information where you can go buy that documentary. They break down a lot of the ways that churches actually misuse money, a lot of the red flags to look for, questions to ask, things that lead to stuff like this. But one of the things that Nathan said in one of our early conversations that this brings me back to was he said, Jeff, the IRS kind of tax code for nonprofits is probably about 60 years overdue for reform, okay? And he said there's so much money that is being funneled through churches and nonprofits. There's so much money that is being funneled through that nobody can track. It's totally tax-free. It's being hidden because these things are churches. Now you got all of these organizations that aren't churches classifying as churches. You got churches that will not tell anybody where the money's going. He said, because the church is not policing itself and the IRS has stayed hands off, he said at some point, there's too much money going through that. If we don't call our own fouls, if we don't bring reform, if we don't start operating in the light financially, then the government is going to get involved because there is way too much money. Okay. There's trillions of dollars, I think, worldwide, billions of dollars, at least in the States, that is going through the church sector. And he says, so we got to do something about this. And if we don't, the government's going to get involved. Now, I can't say this with certainty, but it makes me wonder, as they said, this was part of a nationwide crackdown. Was it just called a nationwide crackdown by the FBI? because this church and this guy was operating with, what looks to be criminal behavior across multiple states? Or is this nationwide crackdown actually a part of something bigger? Are we going to see more stories like this? Hopefully not exploitation, hopefully not forced labor, hopefully not trafficking. But are we going to see more and more cases of the FBI looking into these big ministries? And guys, I think yes. And I think it's both a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing that we get some of the bad players out of this. It's a bad thing, though, that this is going to change the way people think about the church. There are people who get upset about the religion business documentary, for instance, and they will get upset. Somebody got upset this week because I shared the documentary, and they said, I can't believe you shared this. This guy's just angry. This kind of stuff is going to make people run away from the church. And I would actually say I think this stuff will make people run away from the church a lot worse than the religion business documentary that is calling out some of these issues. Okay. I think the best thing that we could do, and hopefully it's not too late. This is why Nathan told me he was doing the documentary over a year ago. Okay. The reason why he said they were doing it was because his hope was that this would bring reform to the church and the nonprofit sector, that the church would start calling our own fouls, that we would open up our books a little bit, that we'd shine a light on them, that we would be more above reproach than the world. And if churches would do that, then the bad actors will stick out like a sore thumb. And people will be able to tell they're not like my church down the street. They're not like the church in my city. That's just a really bad actor. But the problem is, if the church down the street, the church that you go to, the churches in your city are just as quiet about their finances, okay, as these big ministries that are being exposed, then we're going to continue to have questions. People are going to continue to have questions, and it's going to make the whole church look bad. So I really do believe when they talk about this being a nationwide crackdown, I think this should be a wake-up call. The religion business documentary should have been a wake-up call. The mass allegations of spiritual abuse and criminal behavior and everything else, all of this stuff should have been a wake-up call. And if we will wake up and we will call our own fouls, we will demand transparency, and we will work as the church to be above reproach, then, man, this can actually be a really good thing. If we don't, I believe more of this stuff is coming, because these kind of shenanigans, all of this money running through, guys, it's going to cause the system to buckle. That's my fear.
Our Kylie Jones is at the federal courthouse in Tampa, diving deeper into the church and its leaders. But we begin with Aaron Mesmer live in Avila with more on the raid and reaction from neighbors. Aaron.
Yeah, Haley, and these neighbors were absolutely stunned by what went on this morning. Neighbors in this community, they woke up.
And how would you feel if you were in that community? I can empathize. I would be super surprised if something this bad was happening in my community. Financial crimes, that would be a little surprising, but not super surprising. But like a forced labor ring, okay, coming from a church, I would be surprised too. And probably a lot of people didn't even know that was like a pastor's home, or that this pastor was in their community, because this guy is part of just it's kind of a weird kind of online ministry operating in different states. So I can see how they'd be surprised by it. At the same time, if we would look at the red flags that were available, we should have known something was going on. Okay. So it's just kind of a catch-22. Yes, absolutely. If you're in that neighborhood, you would be surprised. I empathize with that. And as the church, we've got to start opening our eyes. We've got to start paying attention, because there are so many good churches. There are also a lot of bad churches. Okay. The bad eggs leave clues. Okay. There are breadcrumbs. There are red flags that will lead you to say, hey, I can't prove it. I can't see it. But if this stuff is going on, these red flags are here. If they don't get taken care of, it will eventually lead to worse things. Okay. Now we hope it never leads to things like this. But the problem is, red flags don't fix themselves, guys. If we don't address red flags when we see them, they will not fix themselves. So if it's not disqualifying sin, if it's not deeply traumatic and painful sin yet, if it's not criminal behavior yet, if it goes unchecked, it will grow into that. So we got to just do better as parishioners in the church. Got to do better as church leaders as well. When we see red flags, not to villainize them or anything else, but to go, whoa, you're right. That is a red flag. Or at best case scenario, it's a yellow flag. That could turn into something if we're not careful. So anytime we see a red flag or a yellow flag that could turn into spiritually abusive behavior that makes the body of Christ look bad, when we see that, even if it had good intentions, even if it's not bad yet, it's our responsibility, not just church leaders, but all of us to go, hey, we got to deal with that. And we're not taking our eyes off that red flag, and we're not going to stop talking about that red flag until we deal with the red flag. What are we doing to make sure that this doesn't turn into something that is going to hurt people in the name of Jesus? Because we should never be, as the church, party to hurting people in Jesus' name.
Helicopters and FBI agents raiding a home in Avila. And once they found out why those federal agents were there, it was even more surprising.
Some of you say, I don't have 100,000, but you have 20,000. You have 50,000 here, or you have 10,000.
That's video of David Taylor asking viewers to send money to his church. Federal authorities now say Taylor used donations to fund an extravagant lifestyle.
All right, so you see, what do you see there in that picture? You see a massive mansion. It's not just a mansion, it's a compound, because outside of that picture, if you look, there's actually more facilities there. You can see that there's a pool there, what looks like a pool house. There's more there. If you look on the front lawn, you see a lot of cars. We're going to get to that here in just a second, because these aren't just cars of people who are visiting, but you see a lot of cars. There's more there. That's what this guy is using donor money to fund. Yeah, what did you just hear him do? It seemed like every time he was doing ministry, this guy was asking for money. Give a seed, sacrifice. Hey, maybe you can't give $100, but you know what you could do? You could give 10. Would you sacrifice with 10? Would you sacrifice with 20? Give what you can. And guys, again, this is so frustrating as someone trying to run a nonprofit above reproach. It is a struggle for me to ask for money. It is a struggle for us to fund this nonprofit, because as a pastor who has manipulated people before and who has been manipulated through tithes and everything else, I struggle to ask people for money, because I don't ever want to manipulate someone into giving. If someone believes in this ministry and wants to give, that's awesome. But I don't want them to feel any pressure. I don't want them to feel like they're getting a special blessing if they give. I don't want them to feel any of that, right? Because it's just a matter of, if you believe in it, give to it. If you don't. So when you have people who are trying to do it the right way, it's very difficult to have enough money to even like pay basic legal fees and basic bills. Okay, now we're all right. God is providing. But it is a struggle to get it there, okay? So just for context, we are well under $50,000 a year as an entire nonprofit that we're operating off of. Well under that mark, okay? But then you have someone like this pastor who brought in, I think over a like 4 to 6 year period, 50,000 plus or 50 million plus dollars, and he's building compounds like this in different states: Texas, California, Florida, all North Carolina, all across the United States. He's doing this kind of stuff. He's living this crazy lavish lifestyle. He's stepping all over people to do it. And yet, what did he do? He asked for more money almost every time he did ministry. Almost every time he was on video, he's asking for more money. A pastor that is asking for more money every single week, or pressuring for you to give more money more weeks than not. I'm not talking about a couple of times a year. I'm not talking about once a month. If they're constantly pressuring you to give money and to give in faith, that is a big red flag for me. Okay, if they're just saying, hey, be generous, and that doesn't even have to necessarily be our church. Please be generous to our church, but just go out and be generous. Wherever God's leading you, that is different. But too many times, it's the pastors that ask for money the most, that have the most money already and are misusing it. They get a taste for lavishness. They get a taste for the big budget, and they want more and more and more and more. And also, too often, it's the churches that are struggling or are using money well and could do so much more ministry with the money that they don't even want to ask, okay? So again, if you got a pastor who's asking for money all the time, maybe there is a need, okay? That doesn't automatically mean that they're a bad church, right? But it's a red flag. Ask. And I just invite you to do this. If you see a pastor or you're part of a church that is constantly asking for money, ask them for their books. Ask them if you can see not a pie chart, but detailed budget. Okay. They have them. Every church has a budget for every department, probably 20 plus line items of where the stuff is going. They can get as detailed as they want. Okay. Ask them if you can see some financial information, if you could sit down with someone and they can just help you understand where your tithes and offerings are because you want to be more generous, but part of that is you want to be a good steward. You want to understand where these things are going. You don't have to be mean about it. Just ask. And a healthy church, a safe church is going to say, you know what? Let's show you that. One that is not, or one that is on the way. They may be healthy and safe, But again, it's a red flag. If they don't do something about it, they're probably on the way on a slippery slope that is going to lead to this stuff. They're going to be the ones that say, well, no, we're scared to show you the money. We're scared to talk to you about where this goes. And the guys, the best churches, and this is what we ask them to do on the Safe Church Pledge, I believe the best churches that are trying to operate above reproach, you don't have to ask because that stuff is already there. And if you ask, they're going to say, oh, yeah, it's already available right here. We've already got that available. We're so sorry we didn't communicate that well, okay? Because they're going to get in front of this. But anytime you see a pastor that's constantly asking for money, it's a red flag. And whether or not they're willing to tell you where the money goes, will tell you a lot about them. Because David Taylor, he wasn't telling anybody where the money went, because if he was, they wouldn't be given to this.
That included this massive mansion in Tampa's affluent Avila community. FBI agents raided the home Wednesday morning.
It's very surprising to hear that type of thing was going on, again, right in your backyard.
It's unclear.
And again, I understand why it's surprising. I really, really do, and I empathize with that. At the same time, guys, and I'm not trying to be hard on anybody individually, but as the church, we've got to move from consistently being surprised. Right? In the last few years of doing this, that is constant. We're always surprised when these things happen. We've got to move from being surprised to saying, okay, there's some systemic problems because this stuff is happening too often. Okay, there's too many news headlines. What can we do proactively to fix these things? And what are the red flags we need to look for and be just super diligent about? If we see these, we are going to deal with them immediately before they grow into something. If we don't do that, we can't keep being surprised by these things.
Clear what authorities took from the home. This view from Skyfox shows several cars lined up with gift bows on top.
So you see these cars here, and I told you we'd talk about these here in a minute. He's going to continue zooming out. There's cars on both sides of this huge fountain in front of this huge mansion. They've got gift bows on top of them, and while we don't know what they're doing, I think it looks pretty clear he was going to be giving cars away that day. How many days out of the year was this guy just giving cars to people? Who was he giving these cars to? And who paid for these cars? That question we should be able to answer. It looks like it was donors who paid for these cars. What you're going to see here in a few minutes is it's not just donors. You donate, you give sacrificially, that's one piece, but he's going to ask you to keep doing more and more and more to please God, to honor God, and to honor him as an apostle, because he calls himself an apostle. And if you're going to please God, you got to honor the man of God. Now, again, this story is crazy and wild, but how many of you have been in churches where you've been taught to honor the man of God, to listen to the man of God? And how you honor the man of God is how you're going to honor the Lord. You just got to trust him. Do you trust your pastor or not? Because he's going to ask you to do things in faith. He's going to ask you to do all that, okay? Many of you have experienced that. I have experienced that. Now, when we're dealing with stuff like that, okay, when we are dealing with stuff like that, we realize, okay, it's not a huge leap from that to this. Because when people start blindly trusting the man of God as if he represents God, then that person is just human nature. They're going to keep asking for more and more and more and more. What does the Bible tell us? The Bible tells us the elders, the shepherds, all of those, the leaders in the church will become servants of all. The greatest will become the least. So if you have someone who is constantly telling you that you need to honor them and you need to obey them and you need to do all of these things, again, that is one of those huge red flags that we should notice. If you got to be called apostle all the time, or you got to be called pastor every time, and if somebody calls you by your name, people are giving them stink eye and they're acting like they're dishonoring them, that's a red flag. It leads to this kind of culture. And while it may not get this bad, it usually will result in spiritual abuse. So when you're looking at leaders, one thing you got to look at, is that leader a servant? Are they humble? Or are they demanding obedience? And I feel like I can only please God if I'm pleasing them. Because guys, that's a man. That's a man. That's a human. All right. I was a pastor for 17 years. Okay. I had a responsibility to serve the church. I had a responsibility to serve the people in the flock that I was a part of. Okay. But I wasn't any more special. I'm a part of the church just like you. And even though I have a different role, pleasing me does not please God. Okay. It's important that we understand that.
Neighbors say the 10-bedroom, 10.5-bathroom, 28,000 square foot mansion is one of the largest in Avila.
Because they was like, how could a pastor afford to live in a house like that?
According to the
So one of the largest houses and mansions in this well-to-do upscale area of Florida, it was owned by a pastor. And that's part of the problem. If you watch the Religion Business documentary, you're going to see a lot more of this. But it's not just the Kenneth Copelands of the world. It's not just these big, prosperity gospel, pastors. There are a lot of pastors in the evangelical, non-denominational megachurch world, guys, who are having housing allowances for properties that are millions of dollars. There are those that the church owns the house for good reasons, and there are those that church owns the house for bad reasons. Okay. Do you know, if you're a part of a church, do you know if your church owns massive property? If your church owns any property, even a small parsonage, do you know? Do you know what it's used for? Okay. But if your church says, well, yeah, we own this $5 million house and it's a parsonage, I don't care where you live, even in really expensive areas, that's too much for a parsonage. Okay. You need to ask questions about this.
The 23-page federal indictment. This house is one of several properties throughout the country purchased by Taylor's Kingdom of God Global Church.
Because Kingdom of God Global Church owned all of these things so that they didn't pay property taxes, that no one had to pay for them. This guy, because the church owned them, was living in all of these places completely for free. But by all indications, he was 100% running the church. So he was using donations, he was using tithe dollars, he was using all of this just to have mansions like this or bigger all across the United States. But because he called it a church, he wasn't having to file taxes on it. He wasn't having to pay property taxes. He wasn't having to do a tax return. A lot of the stuff was off books. And that's why it's money laundering. Because if you ever get caught and people figure out you're just running this stuff through the church for this reason, then it is very clear money laundering. And a lot of churches, it's a lot more gray. What I would love to see churches do, and what I ask my church to do, and what I ask churches and pastors to do when I talk to them is, hey guys, let's just get ahead of this. Let's be open and transparent about our finances. Let's be open and transparent about assets and stuff that we own. And let's not do anything like this that could bring reproach. Let's not get anywhere close to it. And by doing that, then the church begins to operate in a way that's so above reproach that churches that aren't telling you about their money and how it's being spent, you can go ahead and assume it's stuff like this. We can fix a lot of this simply by operating above reproach and operating in the church at a higher, more transparent standard than the world.
He's the pastor and referred to himself as an apostle, according to court documents. The indictment alleges Taylor recruited people to work at call centers, referring to them as armor bearers.
All right. So if you're in the chat, let me know. Got his mugshot sitting right up there. If you're in the chat and you have been an armor bearer, let me know. If you're in the chat and you've been a part of a church, usually a charismatic church that has talked about armor bearers, let me know. Maybe you've never heard of armor bearers, and that probably means you haven't been in hyper charismatic circles, okay? But things like this exist in the non-denominational evangelical world. Things like this exist in the Baptist world. Things like this exist all over Christianity. It may not be called the armor bearer, okay? But these things exist. It is usually made worse and exacerbated in hyper charismatic circles, okay? But this is not unfamiliar, probably for many of you, this idea of armor bearers, okay? An armor bearer is someone who is called to support the pastor. You are serving God by serving the man of God, right? And you're their armor bearer. You're taking part of that burden. You're helping them carry the heavy weight of what they're doing. And that is a good thing. The problem is people who, pastors who are serving you well will normally not call you armor bearers or need armor bearers or ask for them. They simply need the community around them. When pastors start asking for armor bearers and talking about armor bearers, that's a red flag. Another one of these red flags. He makes people call him apostle. He's calling himself an apostle, and he's constantly asking for armor bearers. Those are red flags that this guy has an ego issue, that he thinks people are there to serve him instead of him serving them. And guys, if you are an armor bearer, I'm just telling you, the number one red flag of misusing this idea of armor bearers is if the armor bearer is essentially an indentured servant. Like, what are you doing? Are you always just doing menial tasks? And again, in a lot of your non-denominational evangelical churches, you just may be someone, I may say, hey, I'm discipling you. You're going with me everywhere, but you're doing all these menial tasks, and I'm discipling you because you just get to travel with me and get all these cool experiences. But really, you're just here to be my servant, okay? When you have someone who's making you call them titles and who is asking you to be their armor bearer, and what they mean by armor bearer is servant. You're always doing the crap jobs. That is a massive red flag. And they may be headed for a mug shot like this if they ever got caught. But best case scenario, they just don't understand what serving and what leadership looks like in the kingdom of God.
Investigators say they were his, quote, personal servants who fulfilled Taylor's demands around the clock and were never paid. Taylor and executive...
They fulfilled his demands around the clock and they were never paid. We have talked about that multiple times. I call that volunteer exploitation. I'm not the only one who talks about it, but guys, a lot of people inside the church system, okay, even a lot of you get really mad when I talk about volunteer exploitation. There's always people who say, Jeff, that's not a big deal. The volunteers aren't being exploited. They're big boys and girls. They volunteered on their own. They can quit when they want. If they don't like it, why don't they just quit? That's on them. That's what I hear all the time. And I may hear it from some of you in the chat today. I hope not, but I hear it all the time. But I have stood firm for years now. That is not okay, because yes, they can quit. Yes, they signed on to volunteer, but exploitation and even human trafficking, did you know that the consent is not necessarily required for that? Okay. And here's what makes it worse. When you are a pastor and you're calling yourself a man of God or an apostle or a spiritual father, you are setting yourself up as larger than life. And you are setting yourself up as if you want to please God, you need to please me. And pleasing me is pleasing God. When you do that, then it's not just a matter of a volunteer can say yes or no. When they are being made to feel like they need to say yes to please God, that is volunteer exploitation. Okay. And again, I've been a part of the system that does this. I have to repent because, man, we needed volunteers constantly to feed the machine. And a lot of times it was just manipulation and exploitation, right? I remember serving, guys. I remember serving on a staff. There was another pastor on the staff that all of a sudden he had a brand new assistant. And I was like, oh, wow, you got an assistant, man. She's answering all your emails, she's helping with all your stuff. That's pretty cool. I bet that's helping you. You know, it's really helping you in your job. I didn't know that they were hiring you an assistant. He said, oh, they're not. I was like, then what's going on? How do you have an assistant? They didn't hire you an assistant. He goes, oh, she's volunteer. She's volunteer. She's my 25-hour-a-week assistant, and she's doing that as a volunteer. This is a part-time, near full-time role because 32 hours would have been full-time. She's nearly full-time as a volunteer. And guys, not only was he proud of it, he was patted on the back for it. And he was using it as an example of, hey, we could get a lot more ministry done if more of you guys would help find these people. And there were all kinds of different initiatives, okay? We called them all kinds of different things, but there was all these different ways of we would disciple people, or you would get special access to different pastors and stuff, when the whole point was we were graded. And guys, I'm not kidding. We were graded. It was one of the goals we had that determined whether we got a raise, whether we kept our job, all of that. One of my 5 main goals, one of the last years I was in ministry, was how many people that I brought underneath me that I was discipling that I thought could come on staff if need be. And if they weren't quite good enough to hire on staff, or if we didn't have the money, who would be doing a lot of volunteer roles. And we called a lot of people volunteer staff. Okay. And again, some of these people were doing this for just really good reasons. They just wanted to serve. But part of my issue before I got out of ministry was recognizing and saying, sometimes we got to hold boundaries for people. Because they're saying yes because they want to please God. Sometimes the best thing that we can say is, hey, go home. Sometimes the best thing that we can say is, I know you want to volunteer in this ministry, but you're volunteering in 3 others already. And man, I just care about you and your family. So man, I'm just going to have to say no for you, okay? And that may sound bad, but that was what I was starting to do, because we were having people who were just constantly at the church. And when you started realizing how many hours a week they were spending at church, I even saw some people go through divorces because they weren't spending enough time with their family at home, because they were always at the church, because that was easier than dealing with a marriage that wasn't going well or dealing with kids. And guys, it leads to all kinds of issues. A healthy church is going to say, yes, we need volunteers. Volunteers are the lifeblood of the church. And Ruslan and I talked about this. Serving in church is awesome. It is good. I encourage you to do it. I'm volunteering. God, this week, almost every night I'm volunteering somewhere. But that's also a season. Because if I did this all the time, then I couldn't be a good dad. And a lot of the stuff I'm volunteering for is actually for things my kids are involved in right now. Okay. So volunteering is good, but You should not be volunteering 40 hours a week every week, 30 hours, 20 hours a week every week. If you're spending more than 5, 10 hours at the church volunteering every week, there's a problem, because that's becoming a job, okay? And it very quickly becomes this idea that you may not ever hear. But again, I was on that church staff where we were talking a lot about, we got our paid staff and then we got our volunteer staff, okay? So we just got to be very, very careful about this stuff. Those are other big red flags. Do you have a couple of red flags to look out for here? How often is the church asking volunteers to serve? How many ministries is the average volunteer serving in? Your church probably knows that. If it's a big church or a medium-sized church, they actually have that data, okay? And so how many ministries are they normally serving in? I think one of the churches I was a part of, at one point, it was like the average volunteer was serving in 3.5 different ministries. So they're just all the time doing stuff like that. But also look at this. What's your volunteer turnover rate? Okay. Are there a lot of volunteers who are there all the time and then they burn out and they disappear and nobody knows where they're at? A lot of times churches that do this have a very high volunteer turnover rate and a very high staff turnover rate. If your staff and volunteers are constantly turning over, that is a sign that the ministry machine has started eating the people instead of discipling the people.
Director Michelle Brannon are accused of controlling nearly every aspect of the workers' lives, cutting them off from family and forcing them to take contraceptives.
So these armor bearers weren't just meeting David Taylor's demands day and night. It says that his executive director there and him were controlling almost every aspect of their lives, including making some of them take contraceptives. Okay, this is, and here's the problem. I know this is bigger than most churches. This is bigger than most church volunteer exploitation. But the problem is, the more you have this volunteer submitting to you in an armor bearer type role, in a spiritual son, daughter type role, the more they're serving, the more they feel like that's pleasing God, the more you're telling them that's pleasing God, the more they're going to allow you to do, because it's almost an honor. And it is very easy for pastors to all of a sudden cross that line, even good ones, crossing a line of you're making decisions for people you shouldn't, and you're controlling things that you shouldn't. I actually remember being taken by my boss at one point. I was taken to lunch by my boss and his wife. And I thought we were just going to lunch one day. And we're getting ready to leave. And he's like, hey, my wife's going to come with me. And it turns out that whole lunch was just to grill me about one of my volunteers, because one of my volunteers was going to marry another one of the volunteers that they were close to. And they just weren't sure if he was good enough for that person. So they're constantly grilling me about this person because they're trying to make decisions, and they're trying to impact decisions that this person was making about whether or not they were going to marry their spouse or not, guys. That's real. That's real stuff. Those are real conversations that I had. And I'm sitting there, thinking, that's up to them. I don't have any horse in this race. That's their relationship. Us as pastors should not be talking about that. But so when we talk about controlling every aspect of their life, it's not just this. This is very easy to happen in environments where people over volunteer, where there's exploitation or leading toward exploitation. This stuff can kind of naturally happen, but it's going to get worse. They controlled everything with these people. You're going to see they even punish these people if they didn't do the things that they wanted them to do. But these people, and again, there's always going to be people who say, well, that's on them. They should have just left. No, it's not on them, because they believe they're serving an apostle. They bought into this guy's stuff. All right. All of that. That is a spiritual abuse. This guy was using his spiritual titles, his spiritual authorities to control people and to almost enslave people, guys. And so we have got to stop blaming those people and taking all of the blame. And that's what I hear so often with spiritual abuse from voluntary exploitation is people want to say, well, that's on them. They should be able to say no. And they take all the blame off the church. They take all the responsibility off the church, all the responsibility off of the pastors. And again, we're doing these big fundraising events right now. And that means about 7 times this fall, we've got, 8 to 10 hour volunteer days. I've already talked to a couple of volunteers after the very first week that I said, hey, there's going to be some weeks that I ask you to take off, and I don't want you to get mad at me. Please don't. I'm going to ask you to take off, not because I don't want you to be here, but because I don't want you doing this every time, right? I don't want to use you. I don't want to exploit you. I want you to do this because you want. And I want to make sure that you are okay. I don't want you to get too tired. So every once in a while, I'm probably going to say, hey, even if you're wanting to volunteer this time, could you sit this one out? Could you just take a rest week, right? That's the kind of stuff that we got to be doing as pastors, because again, what are pastors? Pastors are shepherds. What do shepherds do? They protect the sheep. And sometimes part of protecting the sheep is we got to help them set boundaries.
Human trafficking advocates say it's a devastating situation.
And you really had every aspect of human trafficking. You had individuals who were, brought to a facility that they couldn't leave. They weren't being paid. They had production goals that they had to meet.
And authorities.
All right, now you may be saying, Jeff, how is this human trafficking? Again, they're volunteers. Why couldn't they leave? Was he physically forcing them to stay? And from everything I've heard, it doesn't sound like he was physically forcing them to stay. But here's what it sounds like happened. Okay, I'm having to read between the lines in some of this because I haven't found this information. But it sounds like as you become, you're giving and you want to get more involved, become an armor bearer. If you become an armor bearer, you can get closer to me. And you know what? Because of that, because you're serving me day and night, I'm going to take care of your needs. I'm going to give you a place to live on the compound in the ministry center. But now that you're working in the ministry center, or that you're living in the ministry housing, why don't you work in the ministry center to help us get the funds to do what we're doing? So what does that mean? Well, now you're working in a call center. Literally, many of these people were working in a call center and living on site, okay? But you're doing all that because you think that's going to please God. Well, then you're getting punished and everything else. If you wake up one day and you say, you know what? I've just got to leave. I've got to get out. That means changing your living situation. That means losing your community. It means losing your support. And you have believed this whole time that all of this is to please God. So the moment that you say, whoa, the wool was pulled over my eyes, I've been abused, I need to leave. Well, now your whole view of God and faith has shifted because I was wrong. What else was I wrong about? This is why this is human trafficking. This is why this is voluntary exploitation. This is why this is sinful. Okay. So yes, technically these people probably, most of them could have left. But if they left, what would their life have been like, right? This was a slow burn to take more and more and more control. And it started out with me asking you to give all the time and me asking you to be an armor bearer and to serve me. Does that mean that every church that has armor bearers, that every church that asks for money all the time is there? No, but those are red flags. If we don't address this, if we don't get humble, if we don't serve, if we don't protect people, we can get to these places or somewhere in between. And all of that is damaging. All of that is dangerous.
Say if the workers failed to reach Taylor's monetary goals, they faced punishment, including public humiliation, food and shelter restrictions, sleep deprivations, and physical and psychological abuse.
And why did they face those punishments? Guys, that is crazy to hear those things. But why did they face those punishments? Because now they're living on site and they're being taken care of. Yeah, I'm not paying you, but I'm giving you housing, right? I'm doing all that. But most of it doesn't sound like the majority of this was like physical abuse or anything else. But it's I'm berating you. I'm telling you that God is upset with you. I'm telling you that you just don't have enough faith. You're just too carnal when you say something, right? I'm making fun of you to other people, and I'm making other people look at you funny, but you don't just think those people look at you funny. You don't just think those people are disappointed in you. Not just that Apostle David is disappointed in you. You think God is disappointed in you. And then they take away food. They take away shelter. They punish you. When they punish you in these kind of situations, and guys, I've not been in anything this bad, but I've seen a lot of low-key punishments over the years, a lot of low-key, we're going to make you feel the pressure because you didn't do good enough. Guys, when they do that, man, you just want to get back in good standing. You just want to, you want God to be pleased with you again, but they're doing that because they want you to be scared to fail, right? All of this, it got way out of hand, but it probably started with a lot of the same red flags that you and I have seen and maybe even been a part of in different churches. What would happen if people had seen them, called them out earlier, and said something's not right here?
The Crisis Center of Tampa Bay's CEO says these victims will likely face a long recovery. She says there's another lesson every community can learn from this.
This can happen in one of our most affluent zip codes in Hillsborough County. It can happen in your backyard. It can happen in my backyard.
As for the folks who lived with alleged human trafficking, fraud, and money laundering happening in their backyards.
I hope it's not true, but if it is, he deserves it.
I hope it's not true as well, but it looks like it's true. And what she says is if it's true, he deserves what he gets. And he really does, because this is an absolute abuse and misuse of spiritual authority. It's the definition of a wolf in sheep's clothing. It's a wolf devouring the sheep instead of protecting and shepherding the sheep.
Everything he's going to get.
And there was also what appeared to be a federal command center set up just north of here at St. Joseph's Hospital in Lutz. Experts say if there were any human trafficking victims at this property, they likely would have been taken to a nearby hospital for care. Haley?
Let's hope they can get all the help they need. It sounds like they have been through quite a lot. Aaron, thank you.
All right, so that's it for that. Let me go ahead. I'm going to reshare my screen because I'm going to have to show you guys some more stuff in just a second. But I need to actually share the window now that we got past the part that needed sound. All right, and then we'll come back to that here in just a second. But guys, there's all of these red flags. But here's something that bothers me. Aside from the red flags that we could have noticed, aside from the damage, the trauma that's been done to people in the name of Jesus, what bothers me is that the world is often better at seeing people who are mistreated and caring for victims than the church today, and that should not be. The church should care most about the hurt and the disenfranchised. The church should be the ones, we should be the ones bringing healing to people and caring most for those who are going through trauma and who are going through abuse. But again, when I talk about voluntary exploitation, what I hear from Christians most often that are most bought into the church is, Jeff, that's not a big deal. That's just snowflake volunteers, whiny victims, want to act like they got a problem. And then you got this situation. You've even got some of them that might listen to this and go, oh, that's crazy. That person shouldn't have done that. But why didn't they just leave, right? That's their answer. And then you have federal authorities, and you have this person working for human trafficking nonprofit, and people who maybe even aren't Christians, and they're saying, no, we're doing everything we can. We're setting up federal command centers. We're doing our best to help these victims because they're going to be dealing with the trauma of this for a very long time. The church has got to get better at saying, we see you, and we are going to walk with you, and we are going to support you as you pursue healing. And man, we recognize what happened to you should have never happened to you, and we are right here with you as you walk toward healing. We got to start doing that instead of weaponizing victimhood. And we've turned being a victim into a slur. We've turned it into a slur. You're just a victim with a victim mindset. You're just weak. You're just a snowflake. You're just this, that, the other. Man, and that is part of the reason why so much of this abuse grows wildly in churches. Because when people do say something's wrong here, we turn on them instead of hearing them. We turn on them instead of learning from them. We turn on them instead of helping them heal. And guys, that should not be, that is one of the things I think just bothers me the most about this situation, okay? But I wanted to look here as well. Let me share my screen again. I wanted you to see, there's actually from the Justice Department, the Office of Public Affairs, there is a whole article about this that you can read. It says 2 self-professed religious leaders who used physical and psychological abuse to coerce victims to solicit tens of millions in donations, federally charged and arrested. This actually happened at the end of August, but you can actually see from the FBI directly kind of what's going on here. Okay. They've got the 10 count indictment against them. It's David Taylor and Michelle Brannon, who was his executive director. And again, they said this was North Carolina, Florida. I think they said Texas, Missouri, Michigan. They were all over doing this. Okay. And let me see, there's a couple of other things I wanted to point out here, if I can find them. Okay, so they talk about this being human trafficking. This is very important. We'll use every lawful tool against human traffickers to seek justice for the victims. Combating human trafficking is a top priority for the Justice Department. Okay, they also talk about this being money laundering and tax evasion, and all of that. So you can learn more about the indictments here. But I wanted you to go ahead and see, even from the Justice Department and the FBI, they are calling this human trafficking. So again, you may be saying, Jeff, how is that human trafficking? Okay. And this is something that a lot of times when we talk about trafficking, you're only thinking about that as like sex trafficking. Okay. And there's actually a lot of different forms of this. So one of the things that you're going to see right here, and if you just Google human trafficking definition law, okay, federal law primarily through the TVPA defines human trafficking based on 3 core elements, okay? The act, the means, and the purpose. It's called the AMP model, right? So here is how law enforcement and anti-trafficking organizations are going to use the ANT model when they're trying to decide, is this trafficking or is this not? The first thing is the act, what is done. And it says the offender commits an action such as recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining a person. Okay. So sometimes when I'll talk about volunteer exploitation, or I'll talk about, hey, this is getting, guys, sometimes we got to be careful in the church. We're almost like flirting with that line of like some sort of trafficking. People get really mad. But again, it could be the action of recruiting people. Okay. It could be harboring them. Doesn't mean that you're harboring them in a van. It could be like this guy. Well, I gave you a place to live, but you can only live here if you're following our rules and doing our ministry and doing all of that, right? That could be harboring as well, transporting, providing, or obtaining a person. Those are the different acts, and there's a lot of nuance to that. But again, this is more than just what we normally think of with trafficking. The means is the second part. It's not just the act, it's the means. How is it done? The offender uses one of the following methods, okay? Force we're familiar with. Force is what you think of when you think of with trafficking, but it could also be fraud. And when you look into what fraud is, that's a whole gambit of stuff. That could even be promising, hey, fraud could be something as simple as, hey, if you do this, you're going to please God, and then God is going to bless you with an abundant life, and you'll have more than you could ever ask for or imagine if you'll just stay faithful. You're promising like this idea of life. That would be flirting on the edges of this idea of fraud. But again, coercion. Coercion is something that I talk about a lot with volunteer exploitation. And I'll have people going, oh, come on. It's not exploitation. It's not coercion. They're volunteers. They could quit. But yes, it's coercion. People will say it's not exploitation because no one's forcing them to do it. But if you notice, force is only one of the means. You got fraud, you got coercion. This can include physical violence, threats, debt, bondage, or a false promise of a better life. Okay. And you're going to see there's a lot of threats here. There's kind of the idea of debt bondage, because even though it's not debt bondage the way you would think of it, you're kind of in debt bondage to us because we're providing your living space. And we ask you to do that so that you can minister better. But now we're controlling your living space. We can control you, and then false promises of a better life. And then the last thing they look at is purpose. So it's not just the act or the means. Okay. But it's not what is done and how it's done. It's also why it's done. And it says the goal of the act is to exploit the person for either sex acts or labor and services. We think about the first one there. We rarely think about labor and services. But exploiting someone for labor and services without pay is just as much a part of this. Those are purposes that you can look at. Now, you may also be saying, well, but that's not really exploitation. What is exploitation? I find that most people who fight against this stuff and want to say people should just leave this as exploitation, I find that most people in the church don't know what exploitation means. Exploitation is the action or fact of treating someone unfairly in order to benefit from their work, okay? Volunteers, you're trying to treat them fairly. Hey, you can volunteer when you want. You cannot volunteer when you want. We're just so grateful that you're here. Hey, I've had people volunteer with me this weekend. Okay, well, let's pay for your parking. Let's try to pay for a meal. What do you need? What can I do? I want to make this as easy on you as possible because we're all benefiting from this. You're helping this organization you believe in. And man, we could not do this without you. Should be mutual benefit. Okay. When you're treating someone unfairly and you're benefiting from them more than they're benefiting from you, that is a totally different deal. And that becomes exploitation. It's the action of making use of and benefiting from resources as well. Okay. So even when you look at Merriam-Webster here, okay, you can exploit laborers, you can exploit a system, you can exploit natural resources. Exploitation is simply using someone unfairly for your benefit. All right. So the goal is to exploit the person. Okay. And that could also include exploiting them for labor and for services. That's what we are going to see most often in the church world. When you get an unhealthy culture, it moves from having volunteers to having people that you are exploiting. Okay. And again, there's different types of human trafficking. One of them there is labor trafficking. Okay. You can find more information about all of that. But I just wanted to come back to that to show you this is different than what most of us think. So there are a lot of people who, when they look at this, they struggle because they say, this isn't what I thought trafficking was. But the reality is it is. It's a big part of trafficking. And when you see how trafficking worked here, you realize that if we're not careful, an unhealthy, toxic church would be a very easy place for exploitation of people and trafficking to occur. Okay. Which is why we got to be very transparent. We got to be very accountable. We got to make sure that people can call us on the red flags. We got to have systems in place to protect, because bad actors would find the church, I think, a very easy place to do these bad things. Okay. Also, again, should I want you to think about this just looking at these news stories. Okay. So you guys can see, if you just Google Pastor David Taylor, let's just look at some of the stories that are here. Houston church leader allegedly ran labor scheme to buy luxury vehicles and dinners, from the Houston Chronicle. Okay. You've got from Detroit News, church leaders accused of exploiting call center workers in multi-state money laundering conspiracy. Okay. You got another one. Religious leaders with North Carolina ties collected $50 million in forced labor money laundering scheme, DOJ says. Fox Tampa Bay, indictments against church leaders arrested in forced labor network called remarkable by experts. Pastor speaks out after arrest of church leaders at center of federal investigation. 2 church leaders with Michigan ties charged in multi-state forced labor conspiracy. You can keep going, okay? You can go for pages. This is very bad. So let me ask you the question. Which hurts the church more? Because there are always people who get upset with our work and they say, Jeff, are you not concerned that you're hurting the church and you're turning people away from the church? I heard that when we talked about the religion business documentary. Are you not concerned that it's going to hurt the church and turn people away from the church? I know Nathan's been asked that a lot. Okay. And I always tell them what hurts the church more, in my opinion, is when news stories like this pop up. Whether it's this, whether it's the Robert Morris situation, whether it's the Dr. Michael Brown situation, the Mike Bickle situation, the Ravi Zacharias situation, the Bill Hybels situation, you pick one out of probably 100 in Texas right now. Okay. When we have local or national or international church leaders who are making these news headlines because we didn't heed red flags, we weren't transparent, we weren't accountable, we didn't call our own fouls, we hid things. I think all of that does a greater damage to the reputation of the church than teaching about red flags and calling out abuse when we see it and saying, hey, this is not the church. This is not what Jesus has called us to be. Okay. And that is a lot. There are a lot of people who are upset with the religion business documentary who have never watched it. Okay. I've noticed that when I look at the documentary, you guys know I don't agree with everything in the documentary, but I think overall, most people would look at that and go, oh, okay, yeah, there's some problems here. But what if instead of the church getting upset about it, the church said, you know what? We don't agree with everything there, but there's some definite problems there. And across the nation, across the country, across the world, yeah, we're going to start working on that. We're going to work to be more above reproach. We're going to work to live at a higher standard than the world, because we don't want anybody to question, to question who God is or how much he loves them. So I think this stuff hurts the reputation of the church a lot worse than a lot of the stuff that church leaders are getting upset about. Okay. But I also think about this. And again, just using this example of the religion business, because I know they've taken a lot of shrapnel with this different stuff. But you had, if you haven't heard this, it's a pretty good podcast. I'm not all the way through it. I may react to it at some point because there's some really good stuff there. But Sean Ryan recently had a full podcast episode. It's like 3 hours long with Nathan Apfel. But he actually talked about this on the podcast episode the other day. So he's taken the shrapnel as being this anti-church guy in a lot of ways, when he's been talking about this for a long time. But just kind of hear what he had to say about David Taylor the other day.
Taylor got busted by the FBI yesterday. He says that if you talk negatively against him, God's going to you. And he prays off the most vulnerable.
And guys, that is real. I'm going to show you here in a minute, because they called this out months ago, and people get mad at him for calling things out like that. But yes, another one of those red flags, if all these other red flags weren't enough, because there were tons and tons and tons we could have looked at. Yes, this guy has basically said all of his critics and all of his enemies and anybody who doesn't agree with him and comes against him, that the Lord will smite you. Okay. He will unalive you if you don't agree with this guy. Right. So when you talk about exploitation, why couldn't those volunteers just leave? Well, they believed he was an apostle. They believed he had the power to essentially, unalive them. if they left or if they disagreed with him, right? Because he preached that all the time, which we'll get into here in a minute.
He's raised $50 million in about the last decade. His home in Tampa, Florida, his parsonage, paid for by donors, $8.3 million, 28,000 square feet, was raided by the FBI.
Now, that sounds bad, and you're like, well, Jeff, he's just talking about it after the fact. If you've watched the Religion Business documentary, he talks about all this kind of stuff. He talks about how they build these compounds, how they're tax-free, how a lot of people don't know that stuff is there. He talks about this stuff in the documentary. And guys, there are a lot of people, there are a lot of good people who say, well, that's just a few people. That's just the Kenneth Copelands of the world. That's just this, that's just that. It's too many. Okay. And again, at a smaller scale, not, these huge mansions like this, but maybe it's one, maybe it's much small. At a smaller scale, there is misuse of funds in too many churches. It's not the majority of churches, but it's too many. That is what is hurting the reputation of the church. And it's part of what the Religion Business documentary was trying to do, was say, hey, if we'll come up with systems and we will fix this system, if you want to spend the money, but let your donors know where this money is going. It's not a call. The actual documentary, and I'm not talking about Nathan and his views, but the actual documentary is not a call to not pay churches, to not have buildings, to not have pastors have houses. It's not any of that. It's to simply say, hey, let's get this under control. So if we would heed some of those warnings, maybe we don't get to these places. So even if you don't agree with everything he says in the documentary, which I don't, okay, even if you don't agree with every conclusion that he comes to, all right, there's a lot that we can learn if we will pay attention now. We don't have to keep seeing things like this.
He has about $28 million in real estate. So he's taking money from the most vulnerable, who Christ is there to protect, technically. He owns a Bentley, Rolls Royce, all in the name of Jesus.
$28 million in real estate, all the cars. You saw he's giving away cars. Like that, but that is what he's doing with this donor money, guys.
He's got people working for free at call centers till 4 a.m. And if they don't hit their donation quota, they have to get on their knees and beg him for forgiveness.
Beg him for forgiveness?
Because he's anointed, Sean.
They literally would have to get on their knees and beg him for forgiveness. Did you hear Sean Ryan? Whoa. They had to beg a guy for forgiveness? And it's just, Nathan's lived looking at this stuff for so long, and he's like, yeah, but he's anointed. He's the apostle. But guys, in these systems, if we let it go too far and you're serving the special man of God instead of the leader being the servant, it can become this. This is what happens when we let red flags grow, when we let the cancer of sin and the cancer of spiritual abuse grow. It starts out as something small that we can treat, and it ends up being something that destroys lives, okay? But Nathan didn't just talk about this after the fact. Here is actually, this is a reel that the Religion Business shared before, I think this was months before the documentary came out, talking about this. I think they've talked about David Taylor multiple times. But again, thinking about these red flags, thinking about the fact that we could have seen some of this stuff coming if we will pay attention, hold leaders accountable, and call their own fouls. The Religion Business takes all this shrapnel for you're hurting the reputation of the church. But again, I want you to ask, what hurts the reputation of the church more? The news headlines that are out now, or if we had, as the church, heeded warnings like this months and years ago?
Get you, not only for messing with the money that comes through here, God is going to get you for messing with his money in his kingdom. He ain't going to let you.
That's literally his message. That is this guy you're going to hear from multiple sermons in this clip, okay? And the audio is a little funky because I had to remove, there's music behind it, and I had to try to remove as much of the music as possible because YT does not like that, okay? But you're going to hear him say, God's going to get you. God's going to get you. If you don't give, or if you teach people not to tithe, or if you question me or come after me, he even goes after governments you're going to hear in here. This is the kind of stuff he is preaching, which is what's allowed him to exploit people. People are literally terrified of coming against this apostle, this man of God.
You mess with his money that flows through the church by telling people they don't need to tithe, telling people they don't need to sow $1,000 seeds. You are out of order, and God is going to get you.
So God is going to get me, and I'm out of order because I'm one of those people who says you don't need to be sowing $1,000 seeds. I'm one of those people who says you don't need to tithe. If you want to use tithing as a principle, all right, hey, I think 10% is a good way to start in generosity, then go ahead and do that. But you don't have to tithe, because tithing money was never a biblical concept, and New Testament tithing is not a biblical concept. God is not going to get mad at you if you didn't give 10% this week, right? God's called us to be generous. So I'm one of those people. I teach all those things. And he's saying God's going to get you. But listen, God's not just going to get you. He's going to talk. And I've got to mute it out. Okay. There's a lot of words about unaliving and smiting and all that. Had to mute them out. But otherwise this video is going to get flagged and taken down.
I'll rebuke you in Jesus' name. I can speak boldly like this because he is backing me. And I've seen him people for me. You will be messing with this ministry.
I have seen him people for me. I have seen people be smited because they came against me. And then you wonder, how were these people exploited? They were terrified. Because if you believe this guy's an apostle, if you believe he represents God, and then he's even going to, literally in this video, he's going to tell a story about someone who is no longer living because they came against him.
Jesus came to me. He told me that he will people. He says, David, in your presence, because of the power I've given you, people who come against you, they will.
He says God is going to smite people for him. People will be smited for God because they came against this guy. This is the way he is teaching who God is and then controlling people and destroying their lives. Again, this stuff's out there. The religion business aren't the only people who talked about this stuff. If we will heed the red flags when we see them, if as the body of Christ, we will hold the leaders accountable. Okay, your leader is an under shepherd. The moment they are doing something sinful or questionable or there's a huge red flag, you have the authority. We all have the authority together to go, whoa, 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 something's not right. Let's take care of this. And if we will start doing that instead of just giving unconstrained total authority and honor and power to these leaders, then we could stop this stuff. Long ago, this guy should have been removed. Okay? People should have been calling him out. Every church pastor, if every church pastor in that community was calling him out, everything else, then hopefully people wouldn't be giving to him. Okay? We got to call these things out when we see them.
And I speak and appropriate that authority with boldness. All of our enemies are going down. Well, I don't care if you're a government.
Yep, he's bold about it. All of our enemies are going down. Who are your enemies? Our enemies who are going down, who are going to be smited by the Lord. Those are people who teach people not to tithe. Those are people who say you might not need to give $1,000 seed. And that's anybody who disagrees with me.
You are done. God will you. I don't care if you're a judge. I don't care if you're a police. God will you.
So do you see, this is from multiple sermons. And he has said an uncomfortable amount of times that God will unalive people if they disagree with him, if they come against him. Okay, guys, he has been threatening people from the pulpit for years. Okay, so you become this armor bearer, you become this donor, you're part of this church, so you believe in this pastor, you believe he represents the Lord, and then he is slowly but surely, and then more and more and more constantly threatening you that you may not be living anymore if you come against him or you stop giving or anything like that. Do you see how far this can go and how much damage this can do if a person believes that? Now you can ask, why would a person believe that? Well, that's a good question. That goes back to our conversation with Marty Solomon. When we know scripture, it actually helps protect us against spiritual abuse and the manipulation of scripture. But if a person's going to believe him and believe this person who's supposed to be representing God to them, you can see how they'd be terrified to say anything.
You have to plan your, don't have to do nothing. God gonna you if you don't stop. I'm speaking directly under the presence of God now. God is going.
Not only is he saying God's going to do this, he says, I'm speaking directly under the presence and authority of God. I'm surprised this guy hadn't got struck down saying these kind of things.
If you don't stop. You women that's speaking evil, he's going to, the Lord just told me.
Now, by the way, it looks like from my understanding of these allegations, and again, I could be wrong, it looks like part of what some of these armor bearers and stuff were doing was bringing women at times to this guy and having to give them contraceptives or morning after pills or Plan B, stuff like that before they delivered these women to him. So this goes way deeper than that. So when he's preaching and he's talking about some of you women, it concerns me that he is potentially threatening directly victims of SA or forced acts. That would be my concern. I can't say that. I don't know that, but that would be my concern based on the information that is out there.
He says, tell the preachers who will persecute you that I'm coming after them. You're on dangerous ground.
Even the preachers, God's coming after you. If you're a church leader who said anything against him, you're in danger now.
Seen God preachers on my behalf. Yeah,
he literally says, I have seen God smite preachers on my behalf. Again, this is what he was preaching consistently. This is why people were operating in fear. When we've seen this, what happens if we stand up and we say something about it earlier? Could we protect people?
I don't care who he is. If he talks against this, if he talks against the presence of God, he's worthy of.
If he talks against this, basically, if you talk against this guy, then you're not worthy of living. Okay. And again, there are people get upset all the time. They're like, Jeff, you don't have to talk about all these things. You're hurting the church and you talk about these things. No, we're talking about these things so that people will be aware, so that people will not get sucked into this, so that people will hold them accountable, so that people will know who the wolves are, right? We're doing this stuff to protect from this kind of thing. And actually, when we're silent, we become complicit in these sort of things.
Dreamed the same night another staff member, same dream. God was going to, and all we saw in the dream, his head was, he didn't listen to anything. Goes down to Texas and falls asleep. Driving, slides up under an 18-wheeler, his head gets, I dreamed it before it happened.
So he is literally telling stories about people in these sermons. He's not just saying that God's going to smite you if you come against me. He's telling stories about people who are no longer living because they came against him and saying, look, God did that and he'll do that to you too. Okay. So again, guys, this is crazy. This is sick. This is wild. This is gross. Yet, unfortunately, I've heard a lot more Christians who I really believe love Jesus with everything in their heart and soul. I have heard more Christians talking bad about the religion business documentary, or talking bad about people like us or Julie Roy's or all kinds of other people, Mike Winger, who do this kind of content work. I've heard more Christians talking about all of that and demonizing that and saying we're the problem and God's going to deal with us than I have heard Christians lamenting this, talking about this. We've got to make a shift, guys. The church has to make a shift. God is calling more and more people having these conversations, more and more content creators, not to make money, because there's not money in this, all right? I'm telling you, this is very difficult. He's calling more and more people to do that because I believe the Lord is giving us grace to call our own fouls, and if we don't, he is going to expose in more and more uncomfortable ways, okay? We have got to care more about victims and people who are being hurt. We got to care more about being a pure bride. We got to care more about being the hands and feet of Jesus to the world around us than we are about looking bad for calling our own fouls. And I've said this from the very beginning of the podcast, from episode 1. Next week, in just a few days, we're going to have episode 100, okay? In a week, we're going to have episode 100. And from episode 1 to 100, I have said one of the best things that the church can do, one of the reasons why we're doing this podcast, one of the reasons why we started this nonprofit, is because if churches would call our own fouls, we could end a lot of spiritual abuse, and we would actually help the reputation of the church. We would point people toward Jesus, because people don't expect us to be perfect, but they do expect us to deal with sin and imperfection and things that are hurting people in the church. So hopefully we can learn from this, guys. I don't want to talk about some of the stuff because it's so heavy, but this, as wild and crazy as it is, I hope you can see that there were red flags all over this thing. There were red flags for months and years that we could have seen if we knew how to look for them. And guys, even though we're not going to see many churches get this far, okay, if we will look at the red flags, we can actually stop a lot more of the more subtle and less damaging spiritual abuse, because it doesn't have to be a forced labor ring or a trafficking ring for it to be abuse that we care about. We need to care about ending all abuse in the church, because I believe that the church should be, and the church can be, the safest place on the planet. So would you join me in praying for that? But not just praying for that, not just praying for reform. Would you join me in lending your voice for reform? Because guys, this isn't going to start with church leaders. This isn't going to start with the government. The best reform is going to start with the men and women of God, the people of the church, simply saying, we are going to stand up. We're going to step up. We're going to shine the bright light of Jesus everywhere we go. And that includes calling out red flags when we see them, even with people we love, even with people that we trust, even with people that we've known our whole lives, because if we call these red flags out early, not only is that the kindest thing we could do for potential victims, not only is it the kindest thing we can do for the church, not only is it the kindest thing we can do for a world who is looking for a Jesus to believe in, but it's the kindest thing we can do for those leaders. They may not like it. It may be uncomfortable at the time, but it's actually the kindest, most loving thing we can do for those leaders is to say, hey, that's out of line. And even if you don't mean it bad, that could turn into something that we simply can't stand for. So I don't know what that looks like for you, but I would just encourage you to start asking that question. What role can I play? What practical steps can I take to begin making a difference where I'm at and ending spiritual abuse? All right, so we got one more that we'll talk about here in a minute, but I just wanted to jump in the comments because that was a very, very long one, and then I messed up the apologies, guys, for messing up the beginning of the stream, not having that audio. I will this stream will go away when we're done until it's finished processing. When it's finished processing, I'll pull that piece out and I'll re-upload it. So if somebody's watching the stream and that goes away and they ask you about it, that's why. We have to wait for it to process before I can take that out. But I don't want a bunch of people watching it without audio and then missing this content because I think it's important. We'll also be putting this out hopefully as a standalone video soon. If you guys have noticed we're a little behind on those, that is just because of this season. That's just because of all the ministry that is happening, and we should be able to get back to getting all of that stuff coming up soon. So let me find where I was at in the last part of the comments. All right, a few of you are saying that you have heard about this. I'm glad that you've heard about it from other people. Abby says, I didn't realize y'all already talked about the religion business. Yep. Got a bunch of those. I just came across Nathan Apfel on the Sean Ryan show. Yeah, it's actually cool. We've interviewed him 2 or 3 times now, Abby. I've talked to him multiple times since the docuseries came out. And it's just it's one of those things, guys. We are a very small podcast. We're a very small organization. We don't even make, as an organization, we don't bring in enough revenue for an average salary in any state. Okay. But the Lord has been really good to us. Like, we've been able to, and I think it's just the grace of God because of what we're doing. We've been able to talk to some really cool guests before people like Rogan or before people like Sean Ryan actually pick them up. And those are some really cool conversations. So really grateful for their work on that. Okay, let me see. Sherry says it should have been red flag enough with all the women that he was sleeping with. Yeah, I don't know about all of that information. Like I said, I've heard all of those rumblings and stuff since this has come out. I didn't know about a ton of that stuff before, but that's usually an early red flag. Sexual sin, relational sin is a lot of times going to come into play before the other crazy stuff that we see. The problem is, too often we're covering it up in the church for the sake of trying to restore someone, for the sake of offering forgiveness, for the sake of not looking bad, for the sake of protecting the church, right? It's important that we're able to deal with those things, especially with pastors and leaders, because it's a slippery slope. If you start out with like sexual and relational sin, it's likely going to grow into something else as well. Okay. Abby says, looking at that mansion, I couldn't imagine paying that electricity bill. Well, guess who was paying the electricity bill? The church, the ministry owns the building. Those are donors that he is asking to sacrifice and give seed money. It's not going to ministry. It's going to that electricity bill. It's going to the cars. It's going to the bows on the cars when they're just giving away stuff to other people, right? It is wild that they would do that. Abby says, I couldn't imagine keeping it clean. Our house is 2,100 square feet, and it's a daily battle with chores. I feel that in my bones. Abby. Let me see. Susie Q says, if people were going to stop giving and following DET, they would have done so years ago when he was under investigation the first time. To a degree, yeah, some would. I think when you have more Christians calling a person out, I think it is easier to see what's going on than when we're not. Some people just fall they fall into that manipulation. They fall into a cult-like environment, and they're not going to get out of it no matter what. But again, this is dangerous. And I think as Christians, as the church, when we see this stuff, if nothing else, by calling them out, letting people know before you get involved in it, this is cult-like. Here's what's going on, because there have been red flags here for way too long. Now, we can say this is an extreme case because it is. The problem is, even though it's an extreme case, I think most of you would probably agree, these red flags that we've talked about, those are not extreme cases. Those red flags, to a much lesser extreme, exist in a lot of churches. So that's why it's important that we learn from these extreme cases. Hey, what are those red flags that we can deal with, those yellow flags, those concerns that we can deal with in churches before this becomes a really big deal? Because I think those red flags are much more common. Let me see. That is an awesome estate. No wonder he asked for money. Unbelievable. Joni Lamb is another example of wealth from donors. I have heard that that's another example of wealth being misused quite a bit. Abby, I'm with you. This makes me sick. I think that's the best response that I've had to this whole story. This makes me sick. But I want to end here in just a second on the stream. We're going to hear another podcaster and former pastor, someone who's been inside the system, who's now out, who is going to give a much more refreshing take. Because as sickening as this is, hearing someone else talk about these things and it not just be me, it's a good reminder that there are pastors out there who are believing these things as well. They're just trying to figure out how to operate within the system in a way that doesn't like shipwreck their families. And like I said, I've talked to multiple pastors lately, even talked to one today that's, hey, I'm trying to figure out how to fix this in the way that I can fix this. I'm trying to figure out how to operate countercultural to this system that I've always been a part of. And the whole system's trying to pull me one way. I'm trying to go the other way. So it's going to be really refreshing to hear this other take. But the coolest part, the most encouraging part, is it's not just from former pastors. It's not just from me. It's not just from this former pastor, but we're starting to hear a lot of this from pastors in the ministry who are saying, you know what? We're tired of being quiet. Like, we got to start speaking up about this stuff because being quiet hasn't done any good. And we got to figure out how to navigate differently. Let me see. Appreciate you, Abby. Don't forget to like and share the live. We always appreciate that. Kathy says the church is in financial trouble. I don't know if you're talking about just that church or if you're talking about, all churches, but I honestly think if we would start teaching generosity, and I told Ruslan this the other day, if the church was, I think that was offline and out of the interview, but if we would start teaching generosity the New Testament way, I actually believe if we would stop trying to compel people, stop trying to manipulate people, and we'd be totally open and transparent with our funds, I actually believe more people would give and people would give more money than ever. And it could go to the right causes. It could go directly to ministry. It could go directly toward advancing the kingdom of God. But so often it's the things we think we have to do. We have to manipulate people to tithe and to give seed money and to do all of this. And we have to be, coy about where the money's going and not let people know. The things that we think we're doing to protect ourselves in the church or to protect the institution, I think are actually the things that are causing us problems. So again, I think if we would switch compulsory tithing to more churches teaching just New Testament generosity and then letting people know where they're at, I think it would actually help us more than it would hurt us, right? Tracy said, I've been an armor bearer. Absolutely. You're not the only one, Tracy. Elizabeth said, as someone who has been an unpaid worship leader and a worship team member for decades at various previous churches from where I'm at now, yes, volunteer exploitation is real. It is harmful and it is exhausting. Thank you for sharing that, Elizabeth. I know I've got to hear a little bit of your story as well. Yeah, when you've experienced it, it's real. I know it's real not only because I've experienced it, but I know it's real because and again, guys, I hate this, but this has been a part of this podcast from the beginning, being honest. Part of my story is I was a part of it. I was a part of the ministry machine that was, just using volunteers and churning out volunteers. It makes me sick. If you've experienced it or if you've been a part of it and then said, I can't do this anymore, it's real. But it's easier for a lot of everyday Christians to say, no, that doesn't happen in the church, than it is to say, we got to be diligent to make sure that we're protecting against that. The cognitive dissonance that it causes to think that this could happen in the church is very difficult. And then when we think, okay, well, maybe it happens in some churches, but probably not most, definitely not mine, couldn't happen in mine. And that causes us to become complacent and not see the red flags when they actually show up in our churches. But thank you for sharing that. Abby says the burnout volunteer was the worst, or the volunteer burnout was the worst. I remember feeling so guilty for missing a Sunday. And guys, it's another one of those red flags. If you can't volunteer in a week and you feel guilty, then something's wrong. Because think about what the word volunteer means. The word volunteer essentially means, I've decided on my own free will and volition that I'm going to help out here. Our volunteers actually, for one of the big events that we're doing, they even sign a document that says, no one's coerced me to do this. I'm not getting for anything for this. I can stop at any time. I'm just doing this because I want to do this. That's what volunteering is. So the moment you feel like you have to, it's no longer volunteering. Something's happened. Whether it's the fault lies with the organization or the people you're volunteering for, or whether the fault lies with you, something has happened. Because as a volunteer, I'm doing this because I can and I want to, and I'm giving freely. And hey, if I wake up one day and I can't do that, it's been a hard week, I can't give freely the way that I normally would, I can't volunteer the way that I normally would, that's not bad. It doesn't make you feel guilty if it's true volunteering. If you feel like you can't miss a week or something's wrong there, it's always a red flag, and it's a good sign something is wrong, whether it's in the system, in me, or in both. Something's not quite right. And I have felt that way before as well, Abby. So totally get it. Tracy said through the Church Disrupted account, I'm still struggling and dealing with volunteer burnout. It's definitely real. I was actually talking to my wife about this last night. I said, I went for a couple of years where I didn't want to volunteer for any organization or anywhere. And I said, now we're in a season where, like, for 2 months, it feels like I'm volunteering every day or every other day. And I want to be careful. I'm enjoying volunteering again because I love serving, but I've also got to be careful because it took me so long to feel comfortable doing that again. It stays with you, Tracy. Stays with you for a very, very long time. We talk about volunteer exploitation a lot as well. And we'll talk about the long hours that people are serving. I'll have a lot of Christians who will say that, well, that's not true. You're only serving a few hours. But Abby, you give a good example of this. You said, I would be at the church from 8 a.m. to almost 2 p.m. on Sundays. And then I would come back at 5 p.m. for student ministry. And I bet you were there for at least 2 hours in student ministry. So let's say she was there 5 to 7 for student ministry. That's 2 hours. She was there from 8 to 2. So 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2. That was 6 hours. 6 hours plus 2 hours. She was there for a full work day on Sundays. Okay. Well, what if Abby, you served in another volunteer ministry, or the ministry you did on Sunday was doing something through the week to prepare for Sunday, right? Or what about the time that you had to volunteer to prepare for student ministry? All that comes in. It is very easy and very common for people to be serving in a church and volunteering 15 to 25 hours. That is very common and very easy to do. But if you are serving and volunteering 25 to 30 or 15 to 25 hours in a church in a week, that's a part-time job, guys. That's a part-time job. Like, we try to be very careful with our volunteers as well. So, like, even with Tracy, like, Tracy can tell you, I've talked to her about this a couple of different times. I never want this to be a burden. You can always tell me no. You don't have to show up for a live stream. If you're busy, don't feel bad about it. But I've also told her, I don't want you putting tons of hours into this. Like, I don't want any of our volunteers. The rule that I kind of set, I don't want them spending more than 5 hours volunteering a week. If they had to do like 7 one week, that's fine. Take it off the next week. We don't want our volunteers averaging doing more than 5 hours a week. And that's kind of where I'm at in the church. If I'm just volunteering for student ministry, I should be able to do that within 5 hours. If I'm just volunteering for worship, I should be able to do that within 5 hours. When it goes beyond that, it feels like we're using people to do something that very easily either could be part-time work, full-time work, or it could be something that other people could share the load with. Or maybe sometimes we're just doing too much, right? Sometimes that's the issue. In some churches, we're just trying to do too much. It's okay if you're a small church and you don't have every program, right? Let me see. Sim says, why is church even a business? Like McDonald's or something? Can't people just tell other people about Jesus without all of this nonsense? I know it's not a popular opinion, but that's my opinion. I think, Sim, I think a lot of people share that opinion. I also think there's some nuance there. One, you don't need the business to be the church. We're doing a series that we are going to start soon. I'm just trying to figure out where to put it in. But we're going to do a whole series on deconstructing the church and going back to what has to be there for the church to be the church. What is the biblical historical blueprint of the church? What's the irreducible minimum, if you will, to be the church? And then once we know what that is, that foundation, then we can say, okay, well, this is the church. And by the way, with the Religion Business docuseries, that's the number one question they asked through that entire series. It's a question that Nathan asks on almost every podcast that he's on, every interview that he does. What is the church? What is church? People have a hard time answering that. So we're going to do a multi-part series. We're going to spend months going through, breaking down different pieces. What is the church? Once we know what that is, then we can ask the question. All these other things that we put on top of it, like the business structures and buildings and the different ministry programs, they're not bad. They're not sinful inherently, okay? But I think the important part is not to say, hey, let's just get rid of all the buildings and all the business structures, because again, the point of the 501c3 business structure is, hey, the church is donor funded, okay? It's funded by generosity. Well, the whole point of that is we shouldn't be taxing money that's already been taxed. Like when you and I donate money, that's why we're a nonprofit. I don't want people who are donating money to have their money taxed after it's already been taxed and they gave it, right? So that's a good thing. We don't necessarily need to throw out that. I think that is a good thing. I think buildings are a good thing. I like being able to meet in a church building, okay? But it's important to know we don't have to have those. That's not what the church is. It's when we make an idol out of them. But it's also important, and it's something we're going to do in that series. Once we know what the church is, then we're going to ask, should we add these things back to it? And when we add them, what might we have lost that's important to the church? How do we guard against that? Okay. And then two, what kind of guardrails and boundaries do we need to put in place to make sure that this doesn't turn into an idol, or it doesn't turn into something damaging, or it doesn't turn into something to where now we think this is a part of the church? So I think it's a great question, Sim. I think it's a little nuanced, and I'm not very black and white on it. We got to get rid of all of that stuff. I think we just need to understand none of that business stuff is required to be the church, and we should never let it get in the way of being the church. Unfortunately, most Christians today can't think about the church without thinking about a building they go to, without thinking about an event that they go to. And we've gotten so, the church has gotten so tied to a specific system and a structure that we don't recognize church in a lot of situations when it's not a part of that structure. And you can have church in a house with no organization, no official organization, no bank accounts, no buildings, no nothing. So it's important for us to know what the church is. I think that was a good question and a good thought, right? Yep. Abby, I agree. That was gross. Forcing people to take contraceptives was very, very gross. TC says the Armor Bearer was a standard book to read when I was a church intern. I'm going to react to some of these soon because I think Taylor Ransom does a really good job of showing in humorous ways the reality of a lot of church internships. I've ran church internships. One of the things I tried to do to help make those better was to put like caps and limits on how much they could serve. I've just seen them go off the rails. I've been a part of them going off the rails before. And guys, it can happen a lot. And the problem is a lot of new church staff, a lot of people who are at these church colleges and ministry schools, a lot of people who are interns, there is required reading. And the required reading may be things like the Armor Bearer book. It may be things like The Bait of Satan. Those can be red flags. Look at the required reading. Not only what's required of you as an intern, but what is that required reading teaching you to do? Well, with those two books alone, it's teaching you to serve. It's teaching you to honor the man or woman of God. It's teaching you to not ask questions. It's teaching you that if you do ask questions or you push back, it's a spirit of offense. It's the bait of Satan, right? We've got to look at a lot of those books, especially when they're putting things together. A lot of times, if you look at that required reading, you can see, oh, this required reading would make me easier to control. Okay. So we got to be careful about that. And, you don't need required reading to volunteer. You don't need required reading like that out of like a seminary or something. If you go into ministry, I think churches need to pull back on a lot of that stuff because we're basically finding books that help kind of manipulate people to do the things we want to do, to behave the way we want them to behave. And then we're like, hey, everybody in our system has to read this. And man, again, going back to what Sim said a minute ago, we don't need all that to be the church. And that stuff is not bad, but I think it would be healthy for a lot of churches to pull back on that stuff and go, you know what? It's not bad that we would ask you to read a book, but also, again, if you're a volunteer and an intern is a volunteer, we can't require you to do anything. So again, if you're volunteering out of your own free volition, I can't require you to read this book. So if I'm requiring you to read this book, you're not really by definition volunteering. It's a red flag. We're starting to build control into a volunteer relationship, which you can't do. Okay. Kathy says mind control is real. Unfortunately. TC talking about the internship again. I think I was a stipend and worked till early AM for projects and new buildings, all under the guise to please God and pay my dues for promotion. That's what a lot of, and again, with the Taylor Ransom stuff, I'm going to start reacting to some of his videos because it's at least humorous ways, lighthearted ways to look at this stuff. But guys, interns are often used as unpaid labor, or like, man, you'd be making so much less than minimum wage because like TC said, we pay you a stipend, but then you work as many hours as we need you to. Why are you working those hours? Well, it's because you want to be in ministry, and it's almost this carrot on a stick. Hey, if you do well enough, you'll get that ministry job. Now, some people do, but for a lot of interns, they never get that ministry job and they burn themselves out and they get crushed under this burden of, for years, doing all of this unpaid labor because they so desperately want to be in ministry. When God calls you to ministry, you don't have to earn your way with all that unpaid labor to do it, right? You can just serve, right? But so many times, and again, this goes back to Sim's question, which was so good. It's not, I don't think it's wrong that we pay church staff. If your church wants to pay staff for their availability, you're not paying them for their gifts. You're paying them to be available. We want pastors available when we need things. Okay, right? If you want to pay staff, that is fine. But understand why you're paying that staff. But also understand you don't need paid staff and pastors to be the church. A church doesn't need that to operate. The church flourished without those things. Okay, so it is not bad. It's also not completely necessary, right? So if you feel called to ministry and you're passionate and you feel like the only way you can do ministry is to get that paid role, now that's where things go sideways and wonky and spiritual abuse can happen. When we realize, like Sim talked about, I don't have to have that business structure. I don't have to have the job. I don't have to have the title to be in ministry. Well, then we can be in ministry. And when you get that title or you get that paycheck, man, it's a blessing. I'm so glad I get to do this and get paid for it now. But I was doing it for free when I could. The problem was I could only use my gift and serve people for maybe 10 hours a week or 5 hours a week before. Now that I'm getting paid to do it, it's so that I can spend all of my time doing this, right? When we put it in the proper perspective, I think that helps out a ton. I really do. Okay. TC, you're not alone. Says 20 years later, I'm just now waking up to this. A lot of people are. And then you look back at it and you realize how it's literally changed the way you see life. It's changed the lens you look at life through. You may have missed opportunities or education. Like I know for me, I felt like when I started in ministry and when I graduated high school, man, I felt called to ministry. I wanted to be a pastor. I felt like I had to get a paid job to be a pastor. So all of my education, all of my volunteer time, all of my free time, it was all designed to go toward that. And now, man, I'm about to turn 40 this year. And my opportunities, like, I don't even know, like, I still don't really even know what I want to do in my life. Outside of God kind of put this in our lap. I was running a business before that, but I have felt like I've been meandering for a decade now because everything I did, there was no plan B. It was to be in ministry, right? And now I realize I missed opportunities for other education and other experiences that would have just helped me be a better person and be able to have more opportunities outside of ministry. That's one of those problems when people feel called to ministry, the way they get pulled in these intern programs, these colleges and everything else, a lot of times, even if they feel called away from vocational ministry, they don't feel like they have another skill set. They don't feel like they have another way to make an income. And you have people who feel called away from ministry who are staying in the church and hurting people, not because they're bad people. They're hurting people because they're doing something they're not even called to do because they don't know what else to do. And they're just mailing it in and going through the motions. It's actually another thing that Ruslan and I talked about on this week's episode. if you haven't got to check it out, right? Let me see. Just looking at some of this stuff. Sherry, I agree. People are sick of being hoodwinked. Absolutely. I think people inside and outside the church are sick of it. Susie Q, the truth will set you free. What hurts the church is people being bound by the sins being committed in the name of Jesus. That was a whole conversation with a pastor behind the scenes earlier today was, hey, hey, how do I deal with this situation? How do I deal with these allegations that come around somebody in my orbit? And man, my encouragement to him over and over and over again was, dude, shine a light on it. Just be honest, call your own foul, shine a light on it, do it in love. If you hide this, if you're not completely honest about this is going to come back to bite you. It's going to grow. It's going to be something more than you thought. Just, man, dive into it. And actually, man, it's just encouraging him. It's not your fault that you're here. It's you're here because someone else wasn't honest. So the key is to be honest. That's the way that you get out of it, right? Abby, I appreciate you sharing the podcast. I think that was with the religion business, so I appreciate it. Kathy says they exploit people, sick people, by telling them they have to give $1,000 to be healed. They're selling healings. We've actually talked about that. We got 2 different videos about miracle offerings. That part came up. So if you haven't checked out those videos on miracle offerings, they're early podcasts that we did. But yeah, miracle offerings, they feel like people feel like they have to give an offering to be healed, or they have to give an offering to be blessed. Or they have to give an offering for God to come through with any miracle that they need. That's why they're called miracle offerings. And guys, by the way, we're coming up on that season. October through mid-December, end of December, October through December, Q4 is miracle offering season. Okay. That is where you're going to see these. And you're going to see a lot of churches with these fancy named offerings above and beyond the tithe. They're going to really try to get you excited to give. And then if you look, just be careful. Many of them, it's whether it's explicit or implied, it's this idea that if you will give sacrificially, if you will give faithfully, if you'll give beyond what's comfortable, that God will come through for your miracle, that God is going to give you extra blessing, that God is going to bring you that healing. And just be very careful of those. But again, it's miracle offering season. If you know what to look for and you listen to this podcast, you will kind of see it everywhere. And if you see a miracle offering at your church, it doesn't mean you leave that church, but it is an important space to say, hey, let me start asking questions, because this could become something that is very, very dangerous. And it may already be something that's very dangerous. If it's just that year-end offering, what is your church doing to make sure it doesn't turn into more of this miracle offering, right? I agree. Lord, take care of your whistleblowers. Praying for whistleblowers every day, because it is very, very, very difficult, right? Linda, you're spot on. Sometimes people get fooled by cults or cultish churches because it's incremental. That's why most people get fooled, okay? If somebody like David Taylor or a church, if they just showed you all of their bad warts all at one time, or the first time you went to that church, they talked to you about being an armor bearer and working in this call center and being a free intern and volunteering in 5 ministries. If you went into a church and they told you that, you would never go back to that church. But you go to that church, you have a good experience, and then, hey, why don't you start volunteering in this one area? It's a really good thing. Hey, we have a need. Could you volunteer in this other area? Well, yeah, you have a need. I can do it for a little while. And that turns into months and years and decades. Hey, we have another need. Now you're serving in 3 places. Hey, you're such a good servant. What if you became an intern? Or what if you became an armor bearer? Hey, I'm sensing God may be calling you to ministry, right? And it's these incremental things, incremental. And I guarantee you, if you were to ask, if they were to start doing interviews with the trafficking victims here in the David Taylor case, I bet those people would say it was incremental. It was incremental. It was incremental. It felt right, even if it felt a little off. Overall, it felt good. I didn't notice it. And then all of a sudden, man, I'm like, I don't have another place to live. I'm completely controlled by these people. That's how I get into it, right? And it really is that incremental. It's like that old story about the frog being in the pot. If you just throw it in boiling water, it's going to jump out. If it's sitting in the water over time, it's not even going to realize how hot it's getting and the danger that it's doing. That's what happens to a lot of us, right? That is what happens to a lot of us. And I agree, Abby, it is gross. Gusbo says, I didn't know he preached this stuff. People stayed in this church. They absolutely have been groomed by this abuser. And yeah, that is what it is. It's easy, Gusbo, for us to look at it from the outside and go, oh man, that's totally wrong. We should see that. But it's what Linda talked about a minute ago. It's what you talked about, right? That those incremental steps, that's how people are groomed or desensitized, maybe even a better word. But people are slowly brought into this. And then again, if you trust this person, you trust this pastor, you trust this apostle, spiritual father, whatever, they can get away with more and more and more if they do it incrementally. And again, that's why it's so important. If you notice a red flag, not to ignore it. If you notice a yellow flag, not to ignore it. Start conversations, ask questions. Okay, because sometimes, a lot of times, it's as simple as, okay, yeah, that's a yellow flag. It may never turn into anything. What are we doing to make sure that it doesn't? Right? The earlier we ask those questions, the better, because otherwise we get so far down the road before we realize it, and then we're being very, very, very hurt. Right? Linda, I'm so sorry that you went through this. She says, I left a cult-like church back in December of 2024. Nothing this bad. Now I'm going to a good church. I am sorry that you went through that, and I'm so glad that you have found a good church. If you have ever been a part of a cult-like church, high-control environment, you know how damaging that it can be. I'm right there with you, Susie Q, praising Jesus that Linda has found a good spot, right? Okay, so I can't get to all of the comments today, but I do want to go ahead. I want to hit one more segment before we get out of here. I appreciate you guys being so live in the comments, staying with us for today. But I want us to hear what another podcaster and former pastor has said about this. That is the opposite. Okay, as gross as David Taylor's situation was, I believe this is super refreshing. Now, again, polarizing character. Someone that I've had on the podcast before. Not everybody is going to like him. Not everybody's going to support him. Not everybody's going to agree with everything that he does. I totally get that, right? I totally get that. Okay. There's nobody on the podcast I'm going to agree with everybody they do, but I do appreciate that this person has spoken against spiritual abuse, had very open conversations with us about it. But also, again, man, just on his podcast, doing his daily thing, these things are coming up. And hopefully, this isn't just former pastors that are saying this stuff out loud, but we're going to see more pastors who are saying this stuff out loud. All right, hold on. TC, I see that you got a question there at the end. I may have missed some of them, but I did see this. This looks like a good question, so we'll hit it real quick. What is your opinion on a church with a plurality of elders? Is there a safer way to govern? Really curious. I think biblical eldership, a plurality of biblical elders, is a very safe way to govern. Okay. That you have these biblical elders. You may even have a plurality of elders that oversees multiple churches. That's actually how New Testament eldership worked. You would have elders in a city, and they traveled to all the churches in that city. They weren't there day to day, but they were close enough to come if there was anything that was needed. Okay. So the church had to operate kind of outside of an authority structure, but had the authority structure to appeal to. And those elders were going to come by enough to understand the people to be in that culture, right? So if you got somebody, you got a plurality of elders that fits the biblical qualifications of elders, starting with above reproach. Okay, these are people who maybe they're not super well known or super well trusted, right? A lot of times people want elders for their churches that, who do I know who's well known, who can kind of lend me influence. That's not what we want out of elders. What we want out of elders are just qualified, above reproach, kind of salt of the earth people who, if anybody tries to bring any accusation against them, it doesn't stick. That's what above reproach means. So if you have not only above reproach, but all the qualifications of an elder being met, a plurality of elders, people who are not just yes men, people who are not handpicked by the pastor, right? These are people who are commissioned by the church. It's the church that's commissioning these elders. Originally, it was Paul and the apostles who were commissioning these elders, but those elders were overseeing the churches. They weren't overseeing the apostles. Okay, so these people were not being, they weren't being put into place by the people they were supposed to oversee. Okay, so if they're not yes men, they have true authority. They're being put in place by the church, not handpicked by the pastors. I think a plurality of elders works really well. And when it's working, I think that operates best in like the Presbyterian form of government, because those presbyters, the way that all works is you kind of have multiple layers of biblically qualified elders. Now, again, even in that system, if it's not working right, things can go awry. Okay. But I talked to a pastor about this earlier. And it was one of those conversations we were having. As I said, hey, you need to change up your elder board. Your elder board it's not big enough. These are people who are too close to you. They can't truly hold you accountable. I know it's going to be scary. You got to change up your elder board. You got to have people who you're not handpicking, who aren't your friends and family, and it's got to be bigger. It's got to be bigger. You got to have this plurality of people, so you're getting a lot of different voices. Okay, but here's what I think we miss a lot, TC. I also told him this because the early church, when you look at the church in Acts, everybody in that church played a role. Nobody felt like they were a spectator. Nobody felt like they were on the sideline. Everybody was bringing their gifts. This is my church, okay? So people walked in the authority of being the church. There wasn't this laity clergy distinction that we have today. Yes, we have elders that we'll defer to for certain things, but most of the ministry is being done by us, the church, okay? So we don't have a lot of that in the modern church because we have built a system for spectators. We have built a system where you go to church and you sit and you watch, and the most you do is volunteer and get some authority like that. But we're not all having to bring our gifts every single week to make the church work, and we're not all operating on that authority. One of the things that I think would help bring back that authority, and I recommended this to that pastor earlier, I said, hey, you got to redo your elder board. But beyond that, I said, your congregation does not need to make every budget decision, okay? The elders can do that. The staff can do that. Your congregation, and it's fine if you want congregationally ruled congregational governance, that's fine. But your congregation doesn't have to make every small decision. For a lot of churches, that actually causes issues because people don't want to be bogged down in the day-to-day business decisions. But even if you are led by a plurality of elders, I don't think any new pastor, staff member, or elder should be put in place, hired, or removed. Okay? You shouldn't put them in place or remove them without the congregation voting on it, because it is the people's church. The people are the church. It is their church. They carry that ultimate authority. Okay. And if they're that plurality of elders, I really do believe if at any point the elders are not doing their job, or there's concerns, that the congregation should be able to at any point vote one or all of them out and reestablish them. Okay. So again, I think the plurality of elders is a great leadership model. And I think the congregation shouldn't be worried about every decision, right? They should be sitting under that leadership. But if at any point the majority of the congregation says something is wrong here, this is not going right, I think that's a good check and balance. And unfortunately, that is not there. A lot of times, a plurality of elders, it sounds good, but if the plurality of elders is handpicked by the pastor, they're not going to hold them accountable. And if the plurality of elders can't be held accountable by someone else, that's a problem. In the New Testament, those elders being put in place would be held accountable by the apostles, by Paul, by Peter, by James, right? And I think my guess from looking at church history and from looking at the early church is that it was the church supposed to hold them accountable long term, and then slowly we just gave more and more authority. It has been all the rage over the past 20, 30 years, last few decades, to get rid of congregational governance, okay, to move toward a plurality of elders. But the problem is, in most of those cases, those elders are handpicked and they're not accountable to anybody. And that's a problem. Everybody needs to have accountability. And at the end of the day, when we lose sight of the fact that the church is the people and we are all the church and we all have authority and we all have responsibility. Okay, authority comes with serving and responsibility. All right, authority is not something we should seek out. It's something that comes with high responsibility. But we all have that. We all have that responsibility. And when we do that, the church works best. But so if you have a plurality of elders, I think it's good when done well. It's biblical when done well. But you got to ask, what does that mean? Because a plurality of elders, that governance structure means a lot of different things in a lot of different places. So anyway, you said thanks. This is good stuff. I really hope that helped, TC. If you go look at the Safe Church Pledge, if any of you haven't, if you go to spiritualabuse.institute, you click on, I think it's one of the first few buttons, says Safe Church Pledge. You can look at how we recommend churches set up their governance structures. We don't have that congregational piece kind of in there yet. That's not a requirement, but that's the kind of things that we're talking about with them behind the scenes. And even if your congregation doesn't have that authority in the bylaws, if we start asking questions, you got to remember, and I know this kind of sounds bad, but churches don't operate without their people giving, excuse me, and without their people serving. So we have authority and we have influence, even if it's not given to us with titles, even if it's not given to us legally, with your time, with your talent, with your treasure. We should give that freely, but we should also be willing to withhold that if pastors are not listening when there are red flags. Go, hey, look, I want to give. I want to serve. I can't in good conscience serve if we're not going to deal with this red flag. Okay? We're not trying to hold anybody hostage, but we've got to be having those conversations. If they're not having those conversations, still serving and still giving is actually us becoming complicit in the abuse or complicit in the potential abuse. All right, my throat is dying. So let's try to get into this last segment, and then we will be done for today, okay? And again, we will not be back Thursday. We're taking Thursday off because we're doing episode 100. I will fit a live stream in if I can on a Friday, but may not be there. So if you want to look for it, feel free to look for it, but just don't get upset if it doesn't happen. I'm not sure we're going to be able to make it happen, but then hopefully next week we're getting back to that Tuesday, Thursday rhythm a little bit more often. But let's go ahead and get into this segment. This is a really big problem in the church, yet most Christians don't know about it. And if they know about it or they've heard about it, they don't want to talk about it because it doesn't sound like something that should happen in the church. What is it? It's volunteer exploitation. Volunteer exploitation has become a huge problem in a lot of the evangelical industrial complex over the years, okay? In a lot of churches, it's not uncommon to have volunteers serving 15 to 25 hours a week, guys, across multiple ministries and feeling guilty that if they don't show up, they're not pleasing God, they're being disobedient, and they are letting people down. And because they feel like they're pleasing God when they're doing this, there are people who are giving time to the church that they should be giving to their first ministry, which is to their family. They're giving time to the church that they should be giving to their own physical health. Now, do not hear. I want you to hear what I'm saying, but don't hear what I'm not saying, okay? I love serving, and the church needs volunteers to run, okay? I love serving. You should love serving. Serving is a fun thing to do. We are not anti-serving, but when serving crosses the line from serving and volunteering to exploitation and using people as unpaid staff, that can become a problem that leads to significant spiritual abuse. And if you missed it earlier, we did a video on the David Taylor situation. We had a church that ended up being busted, a church and its pastors being busted for human trafficking and a forced labor ring, because that's the kind of thing that can happen when this blows up and when we don't worry about protecting volunteers and holding boundaries for them. Okay, so what starts out as a simple volunteer exploitation that leads to burnout and light trauma can become something like this that destroys people's lives for forever. Okay, now that's a big gamut, but the best thing that we can do as the church is make sure that we are caring for one another's brothers and sisters. We're all pulling the load, but we're not exploiting people. We're not using them. And that's what this former pastor is talking about today. Tim Ross on the Basement podcast was actually talking about this. This came up in their conversation. And someone who has spent time in the evangelical industrial complex. He was a lead pastor of a church. He was at big churches like Gateway and the Potter's House. He knows the systems. He knows the problems in these systems. And Tim is someone who felt called away from those systems to do a different type of ministry. And just like I feel like I have a unique perspective to speak into spiritual abuse because I was a pastor for 17 years, Tim is another former pastor who can speak into the systems in a way that maybe everyday Christians can't. So I want us to listen in together because I think the way he talked about volunteer exploitation and the way that he talked about what volunteering should look like in the church, guys, it was a breath of fresh air. I think you're going to think so too. And it is this kind of idea, looking at church and volunteering this way. Again, coming from a former pastor, and as a former pastor, I totally agree with him. When we get a proper view of this, This protects people from exploitation, and it protects people and the church from spiritual abuse with volunteers that a lot of times is unintentional but can go off the rails real quick. So let's listen to what Tim Ross had to say about volunteer exploitation on a recent episode of The Basement.
A desire to serve, that's a beautiful thing. I have a desire to serve. I don't want to be exploited. I don't want you to.
That's right. Okay. Volunteering is a good thing. Just like I said earlier, serving is a good thing. I agree with Tim. I want you to serve, and I do serve. But volunteer exploitation, being exploited, is very different from serving.
Take my desire to serve and turn me into a modern day slave of your church.
Now, I have said stuff like that for a couple of years now. Multiple times a year, we talk about this. And every time I say something like that, and we talk about volunteers in some of these systems, interns in some of these systems, becoming like almost modern day slaves, I have people coming out of the woodworks mad at me that, Jeff, that's hyperbole. They're going overboard. It's not that bad. Well, I'm not the only one saying it. Tim says it because Tim has seen it and Tim has been a part of it. Okay. He says, look, I want to serve. Serving is good, but I don't want to be exploited. And there's a fine line between I'm serving out of my free will. Now you're expecting it. You expect more, you expect more, you expect more. And now all of a sudden I feel like an indentured servant. I feel like I have to be there. Just like somebody said in the chat earlier on the live stream today, if you missed it, I used to feel guilty if I had to miss a Sunday or a Wednesday. I was there for 8 hours on a Sunday, but if I had to miss, I felt guilty. So it's like I'm working a part-time job and I feel guilty if I don't work this part-time job for free. Again, it can happen really subtly. Volunteering is good. Volunteer exploitation does a lot of damage.
And then throw Jesus glitter jargon all over it. Come every weekend with your fresh yes. You about to get this fresh no.
I love it. I love it. If you missed our previous conversation with Tim, we actually had a full conversation with Tim Ross right here. But I love it when he talks about throwing Jesus glitter on stuff, because it is a nice way and an honoring way of talking about a lot of this. Okay, we throw Jesus glitter on a lot of stuff. Okay, if I can attach Jesus and pleasing God and honoring the Lord to these things, I can get you to do things that you would never do in any other situation. Why? Because I threw Jesus glitter on it. Now you think you're honoring God. You're putting a smile on Jesus's face by doing this. Okay. So yesterday I volunteered to run the clock. Okay. Because I volunteered to run the clock at JV football games. Okay. Because I've got a son who's playing football. All right. But I do that most of these weeks. I enjoy doing it. It's a couple of hours. I love doing it. But I'm gonna have to miss in October. I'm gonna go on a trip and I'm gonna have to miss. And I don't feel bad about missing at all. Because I'm going on a trip. I'm a volunteer. If I'm not there to do it, somebody else will do it. They will figure it out. Okay, right? I do not feel that guilt. Now, if this was at a church, though, it wasn't a sporting event, it wasn't a school. If this was at the church and we threw a little Jesus glitter on it, and it's like, hey, let me throw this Jesus glitter on it. Hey, I know you got that trip planned, but man, people are just not going to experience Jesus the same if you're not here. Do you think you could be here and maybe just leave a little later for your trip? Or maybe you think you could come back a little early for your trip? Or, if you really got to take this trip, do you think you could train like somebody else to do this? And it's like, no, when I'm talking about doing this for a school or an outside organization, no, I can't do any of those things. If you want to send somebody to watch me doing this while I'm volunteering, I will gladly train them, but that is not my responsibility. I'm not leaving late. I'm not coming back early. I'm going to take this trip and I'll be back and I'll volunteer. And if you make me feel guilty about it, I'm not going to volunteer. But in the church, a lot of times we go, well, I probably could. I could probably rearrange my schedule, or, maybe I could train somebody back, or maybe I'll just cancel this trip. Or if you don't do those things, you feel guilty the whole time saying no. And I love what Tim said, that idea of putting your yes on the table. I preached this, guys. I had a sermon that I preached. I hate looking back sometimes at how I got so pulled into the system. I was a part of this. So, I'm not throwing shade at pastors. We just got to be mindful that even if we're doing this on accident, we're doing this and we got to stop. Okay. But I preached that sermon. Man, you got to give God your yes. Put your yes on the table, right? And I do have to give God my yes, but I don't have to give you my yes. And giving God my yes is, Lord, I'm going to be obedient when you call me to do something. That doesn't mean that I'm going to be at my church, hell or high water, no matter what. I can miss a week and it is going to be fine. Okay. If I don't show up with my gift, somebody else is going to show up with their gift. We've all got to do this together. We've all got to bring our gifts. Okay. But we should not feel guilty if we can't do something for a week. Right. So I think that is very important for healthy places that we're not going to feel guilty if we can't serve for a week. And the level of guilt, let me just say this, the level of guilt that you feel when you have to say, I can't serve for a week, the level of guilt you feel when you have to take a week off from volunteering, that will tell you a lot. It'll tell you if either you're a part of a toxic system or, and guys, this is uncomfortable. For some of you, it's not a toxic system. For some of you, you're playing a role in this because your guilt comes from you're not healed in other places. And you're getting so much meaning from that serving that you're overdoing it, okay? But when you're volunteering in a healthy place, from a healthy place, you should never feel guilty if you have to miss a week.
About to get a really fresh, sizzling no from me. Are you going to do my admin stuff? Are you going to come back with the admin? No, I'm not going to be able to do that. Oh my God. Will you be helping us with the, no, I won't be able to do. Oh my God. What's going on? I will.
It should be that easy. Like he said that with a smile, guys, and it should be that easy. Like, hey, I get that you need people. I know that's hard. I've done that before. I've been in that role, but yeah, I can't do it. You're going to get my no, and that's going to be okay. I can say no. That's teach my kids all the time, guys, and no is a complete sentence. That's okay. You don't have to feel guilty about that. You can say that with a smile. We got to normalize that in the church. I would love to be able to help, but no, I can't do that this week because I've got something going on, or I'd love to be able to help, but no, I've actually got something after church that I got to go to, right? No, that doesn't mean that we do that every week. We serve, but we shouldn't feel guilty about saying no. It should be that lighthearted that, yes, I can tell you no, but what Tim is illustrating, this happens in a lot of churches. This is where volunteer exploitation starts, and it starts in kind of an innocent way. I say, no, I can't do this, or I hit the decline button on Planning Center, right? When you hit decline on Planning Center, that's done. That's a complete sentence. You shouldn't have to give reasons, okay? If you say, hey, I'm so sorry, I can't be there this week, that conversation should be done. When we have leaders in the church, volunteer or staff, it doesn't matter. When we start making people feel guilty about saying no, or we start questioning why they're saying no, we are now crossing the line from them volunteering to us controlling. We're crossing the line from them volunteering to us expecting. Okay, so that is one of the earliest red flags. If we see this red flag and we address it, it will keep churches usually from getting into an unhealthy volunteer environment or volunteer exploitation. Okay, if you're a church staff member and you notice yourself asking those questions or saying something that makes somebody feel guilty about not volunteering, that's just a check for you to go, whoa, I'm so sorry. Enjoy your trip. I'm so sorry. Enjoy your week off. I got to check myself, right? That's just a good sign that, hey, I'm just being driven into, I'm kind of sliding into this unhealthy place. I need to fix that. Yes, I need a volunteer this week. Yes, that's going to cause a bit of an issue, but it's okay for that person to say, no, God's big enough. He's going to take care of this. I will move on. I don't need to make them feel guilty. It's the same thing if you're on the other side of it. The moment that you realize a person's asking those questions, we don't have to assume a bad motive. We don't have to assume that they're a spiritual abuser, right? They're probably just so worried about trying to figure out that volunteer role, but we got to call it out when we see it. Hey, why can't you be here? What's going on? Like Tim said, what's going on? Is everything okay? Or are you sure you can't just leave early or do this or that? Or hey, why are you missing again? Right? You hear any of those questions? Excuse me, guys. You hear any of those questions? A good answer is to say, to be able to just call that out. Hey, I've got something else going on. I don't really think it's healthy to have to answer those questions. I just can't volunteer this week, right? Hey, I appreciate that you care. But when you say that, when you ask all those questions, when you keep pushing, it makes me feel guilty for not being here. And as a volunteer, I don't think that I should have to feel guilty if I can't be here. I want to be here. And if I could be here, I would. Okay. So I just need you to know, I don't think you meant that as making me feel guilty. Those are hard conversations, but just like scripture talks about, as iron sharpens iron, one man sharpens another. Guys, in the church, we got to normalize those uncomfortable conversations. Hey, I caught you doing something right there. I'm sure that was completely innocent, but I'm just going to put up a boundary here. Okay. I just can't do it. Right. Same thing when you realize it as a staff member. You know what? I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have done that. Have a great week. Right. If we catch those things, it goes a very long way toward protecting a safe volunteer, a healthy volunteer environment.
Continue to give God my yes. You're going to start getting my no's. I just got married. I'm going home. We're going to We're going to brunch.
And he says, God's going to continue getting my yes, but you're going to get my no's. Guys, this is massively important. And every time, well, not every time, but most of the time we see spiritual abuse, what we end up seeing is we see at some level an unhealthy conflation with my pastors or my church staff, what I'm doing at church, and God. Okay. Telling your pastor no, telling a church staff member no, telling your church no is not telling God no. Okay. That is very different. And sometimes telling God yes will take you outside of the church, right? There might be something in your community that you need to do to be the church that causes you to miss an event at your church, and that is okay. When we can't separate, when we cannot separate God and the church, or we cannot separate God and our pastor, or God and a church staff member, that's where spiritual abuse thrives, because those people are not representing God. Those people are not in the place of God. They are sinful people, broken people, people who are going to do good and make mistakes just like me and you, okay? So it is unhealthy for you and unhealthy for them when we believe that saying yes to them is saying yes to God, and saying no to them is saying no to God. So even though Tim doesn't go deep into this as a former pastor, he just verbalized something that I think is very, very important, because that little nuance of conflating saying yes to God and saying yes to my pastor, or saying no to God and saying no to my pastor, it is the slippery slope at the top of the slide of spiritual abuse. And that going over that, when you step over that, that can put us into really bad places. So it's something we've always got to keep on the forefront of our mind. And I'm so grateful for all the healthy pastors out there. There are so many that go above and beyond to do that, to remind people, hey, I'm your pastor, but I'm a person just like you. I'm called to a higher standard. I have a role. I have a gifting. I'm a person just like you. Check me. I mess things up too. Pray for me, because I need prayer too, right? Good leaders and elders, they realize that to be a leader actually means becoming a servant, okay? And the more influence and authority they have, the more humble they become. They don't want the titles. They don't want all that other stuff. And they're going to help remind you that they are not the same as God. And that although they're trying to be a good example for you, that they don't represent God for you, because they are going to blow it.
We get here before the church service begins, and we don't leave until the parking lot's empty, and we miss brunch. We're going to brunch. I'm going to Cheesecake Factory before they stop selling the Belgian waffle.
You're so refreshing.
And that sounds, guys, that may sound like such hyperbole, may sound like he's overdoing it. But as my wife volunteered in the church for years. She was a staff member for a while. I was a staff member. There were some really simple things like brunch that we had just never gotten to do, man. We had never gotten to do that because we were always having to be there on a Sunday. And we'd have to cut trips with family and stuff short because we had to be back for Sunday. And when we were both off staff and there was a small season where we weren't volunteering, it was so refreshing to have those moments. So now, a couple of, weekend before last, I was volunteering at my church. We're at our church most weekends, right? We're volunteering all the time. This Sunday, nobody was volunteering. We were exhausted and we just needed a day of rest. We just needed a day to be poured into. And that is okay, right? So it may sound like something so simple, but the idea of, hey, we're going to take a week off from volunteering so I can, as a husband and wife, we can go have a date at brunch. Or as friends, we can go to brunch, right? That can be something so simple, but so life-giving that allows you to return the next week and be on fire to volunteer, right? But you shouldn't feel like, man, I can never leave and go get lunch or do something because I've always got to be the person to do this. And if I don't, I'm going to let God down. Here's the reality, and this is uncomfortable. Okay, we know this with our job. We don't always act like this is the case in church, though. Care about your job. Be passionate about your job. That's good. Scripture says, whatever you do, work at it willingly with all of your heart as if working for the Lord and not for men. I want to do good work with all the things that I'm doing. But at the end of the day, right, when you're at your job, if you pass away tomorrow, they're going to replace you next week. 2-3 weeks later, they're going to forget about you. You are replaceable. Okay. Me as a content creator leading SAI, what I'm doing is important. I want to put everything that I have into it. I want to be a good and faithful steward. But if I'm gone tomorrow, you will find another content creator. If I'm gone tomorrow, God will raise up someone else in my place to do this work. He may raise up multiple people in my place to do this work. Okay. I'm replaceable. We know that with jobs and careers and regular stuff in life and volunteer stuff in life. But with the church, for some reason, too often we begin to think we're not replaceable. And if I don't do this, I've let God down, the kingdom is going to suffer. When guys, again, just pulling back the curtain, I was a pastor for 17 years, small churches, church plants to large top 100 mega churches. If you're not there next week and you leave the church or you were to pass away, it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt because you were a valued part of the church. But the church is made up of many organisms. And just like when a cell dies, the body replaces it with another, the church is going to be okay. Somebody else is going to bring their gift and fill that volunteer role. Okay? What matters is that you are healthy. What matters is that you are living life abundantly. What matters is that you are not just doing things for God, but you are walking intimately with God and you're experiencing his love and his refreshingness, right? You're experiencing all parts of that. And that comes with the good and the rest. We're all replaceable. Okay. So we think if I'm not there, man, the kingdom's going to suffer. If you're not in the church and you're supposed to be, yes, the kingdom's going to suffer because you got a gift to bring and we're better with you. Okay. But at the same time, the church is a body made up of many parts. And if you need a week off, you're sick, you're hurting, you're struggling, right? Or you're just tired, you're going to be okay, right? None of us by ourselves are going to sink the kingdom. God is bigger than that. We have that big belief in God. God is going to get this taken care of. So I want to give him my yes. I want to be obedient. But when I can't do, when I need a break, that was the whole point of the Sabbath for Israel. It was to remind them, even when you can't, God can. Even when you stop, God can and God will. So I hope that has given you some freedom and encouragement today. If nothing else, that you hear that God has got this. And it's okay for you to rest every once in a while.
Tim, I'm so grateful for you.
I get really defensive.
And she said, all right, I'm going to go back here in that because I want you to hear that. She said, that is so refreshing, Tim. I'm so grateful for you. And I agree. And this is something I'm starting to hear from more pastors behind the scenes. I'm hoping we'll hear publicly. But I think it is refreshing when you hear someone who is a pastor or has been a pastor saying, you know what? You don't have to feel guilty if you have to miss a week. When they talk about volunteer exploitation, and we are remembered that we are supposed to be doing this out of the overflow because we're a part of the body of Christ, not out of guilt or not like it's a volunteer job.
I'm so grateful for you.
I get really defensive and overprotective. That's my apostolic nature. I don't like to see people being taken advantage of.
Okay, now let's stop right there. That's going to bother some people. Okay. Tim says that's my apostolic nature. Now, regardless of your theology and your doctrine and where you come from on this, regardless of whether you believe there are modern apostles or not, there's something very important to catch here. Okay. Don't get bogged down on that minor. Believe what you believe. Don't change your doctrine and your theology for this conversation. Okay. But this is something very important that he said. Tim says, my apostolic nature is I get very protective of people being taken advantage of. My apostolic nature is I get upset when I see people taken advantage of, and I want to proactively protect the sheep in the body. Okay, there's that. Now, and if you missed this part of the stream, we got it in another video with David Taylor. David Taylor said, I'm an apostle. You have to do what God tells me because I'm an apostle. And if you don't, you're disobedient to God, and God may smite you. I need armor bearers to serve me day and night because by serving the man of God, by serving the apostle, you were serving God and his ministry. One says, serve me and don't cross me. And the other says, being an apostle, being in a position of authority, right? We're just taking this word. Both of them are taking a position of authority. One says, my authority means I must protect you and I must serve you and I must get low. One says, my authority means you must serve me. One says, my authority means I must serve you because by serving you, I serve God. Okay? Doesn't matter whether it's a pastor, whether it's an elder, whether they call themselves a prophet, this, that, or the other. When someone is giving themselves titles, that should show up with more humility and it should show up with them serving people. If someone's title and authority shows up in them asking more people to serve them, that's a problem. If they're asking more people to serve them, they don't get it. They don't deserve to be served. Okay. And that is a huge red flag of leading to spiritual abuse. And unfortunately, we have forgotten this in the church. Jesus was very clear. the greatest among you will be your servant. The first will become last. Shepherds weren't served by the sheep. Shepherds got dirty and got in the muck and got in the mire to do everything they could to protect the sheep. Shepherds didn't lead up front. Shepherds didn't lead from the back. Shepherds led from amongst the sheep. And the sheep knew their voice, and they would give a command. They'd be amongst the sheep so all the sheep could hear, because when they heard that command from the shepherd, they would follow it. Okay. We have forgotten what this is. And in the church now, what we call it is we say, well, yeah, if you want to be a leader, you got to be a servant leader. We don't have to say that, because biblically, a leader is a servant. And the greater leader you are, and the more authority you have as a leader, the more you are a servant. You don't have to say it's a servant leader, because servant and leader are the same in the kingdom.
Again, your pastors, I know they're good people. They're just running antiquated plays. And their turnover rate in their volunteer department, I know you're not the only one.
No.
You're just the latest one.
Now, I don't know if I 100% agree with Tim on that. He said, hey, your pastors, I know they're good people. They're just running antiquated plays. They're not doing this on purpose. They're not trying to hurt people. They're just running antiquated plays. I think it's nuanced. I think most pastors are good people. I think most pastors don't want to hurt anybody. They want to protect the sheep, but they get so focused on what they think the church is. They get so focused on growing the church and programs that they lose sight of people for the sake of the programs. And they say, well, the programs and the ministry and the services are for people, but those become such a big deal that they're willing to step over people to get there. They're willing to hurt people to get there. In my interview recently with Ruslan, this week's episode of the podcast, we actually talked about that. We called that sacrificing people on the altar of ministry. And the ministry becomes so important that we sacrifice people for it. If you're having to sacrifice people on the altar of ministry for ministry, Jesus is not in that ministry. Okay. Now, so I agree with Tim on that. Most pastors are trying to do a good job. They're just getting pulled by the system. They don't realize how much they're hurting people. At the same time, we can't discount that. You're a shepherd. Your job is to know better. And if you listen to the Lord will tell you better. Here's the other problem. I agree. Tim said they're just running antiquated playbooks. They're running antiquated plays. They're running antiquated systems. They're running systems that are not biblical systems that are given to them. Okay. But again, I agree with that and I empathize. I have been there. Okay. I talked to a pastor today. I said, hey, this person's kind of disqualified themselves. And it wasn't because they were trying to hurt somebody. They got sucked into the system. But at the same time, I said, they at least temporarily have disqualified themselves because they knew better. And they are supposed to be the ones who know better and check the system. I've been there. I've been there. My prayer is that this person can be restored. But being sucked into the system, they allowed that to happen. Okay. So I agree with Tim that many of them are not doing it on purpose, but at the same time, we still have to carry responsibility for those things as church leaders. But I will say there are some wolves in sheep's clothing. We talked about David Taylor earlier. I feel like David Taylor was doing that on purpose. We've seen some other church leaders who are doing this on purpose. So we got to be able to look, and we got to be able to look at the fruit of a pastor. Okay. And while most pastors, when they do hurt people and make mistakes, it's not on purpose, and we want to give them as much grace as we can, we still hold them accountable, while also holding them accountable with this as much grace as the situation can muster and as we can muster. At the same time, we got to watch people's fruit. We got to judge people's fruit. And again, if their fruit is the bigger title, the more leadership position, the bigger our church is, the more I expect people to serve me, okay, then we can't treat that like an accident. That's a fruit issue. You're showing you're not ready to handle that level of leadership. You're showing you need correction and discipline, okay? And you're doing this on purpose. Maybe you're not saying, oh, I want to hurt this person, but you're saying my ego is driving me, okay? And we got to be careful of that, because that turns into wolves in the sheep pen, okay? And we got to know the difference between a shepherd who makes a mistake, because they will, and a wolf who is just appealing to, whoops, my bad, I made a mistake, okay? So that's the only place where I would really disagree with Tim, but I do agree the majority of pastors are not trying to do this kind of stuff on purpose. One of the kindest things that we could do for these pastors is be willing to have uncomfortable conversations with them. Be willing to say, if we see something, hey, can we talk about that? That felt a little funky. Here's how that made me feel. And I think most pastors are going to be receptive to that. If not, that gives you a good indication of what's going on. When we don't say anything, we allow it to grow. At the same time, we got to trust what our eyes see. When we see red flags and they show us red flags, we got to understand they're there for a reason. Okay. That doesn't mean that we write that person off, but it does mean you got to stop. We got to hold you accountable, and we're not making excuses. We got to trust the eyes that God has given us. We got to trust the fruit that we're seeing. Okay. Man, if someone is producing thistles, we got to be willing to say it's thistles and not go, well, those oranges are a little weird, but I think they'll grow in. Let's give them grace. These oranges will eventually come in. No, those are thorns. Those are thistles. They're never turning into oranges. Okay. So I think there's this nuance. Okay. Pastors are not going to be perfect. We can hold them accountable while also giving them grace. We can have conversations while doing it in love. Okay. They're not perfect, just like we're not perfect. Again, they're not God. We need to get better at that. And we need to understand that most pastors, most churches, most pastors are not these spiritual abusers that we're talking about. Okay. Now, at the same time, when we see rotten fruit, and even if it's not rotten fruit and it's just unintentional danger, when we don't deal with what we see, when we don't hold people accountable, then even good pastors who are trying to do it well can end up becoming harmful people who are doing much harm, much pain, who become spiritual abusers. How do they become that? Not because they're bad people. They become that because no one held them accountable, and we allow that to grow. Okay. So we got to trust what we see. We got to hold people accountable. Remember, the Bible gives us a very high standard for elders for a reason. The Bible gives us a very high standard for teachers for a reason. Because guess what? Our flesh, people want to be up front. And I want to be a teacher. That seems like a place of honor. What does Jesus do? Again, he's reminding us that the greatest will be the last, right? That the greatest will become the servant of all. So he reminds us with things like, oh, not many of you should want to be teachers because teachers will be held to a stricter judgment. Well, I want to be a teacher and I want to be up front. Whoa, I don't want to have a stricter judgment. That brings us back to balance. Okay. I want to be an elder. I would love to be, to have some authority in the church. I would love to have a title. I would love to do all that. Whoa, these are the requirements. Above reproach, I've got to live in such a way that no one can bring a reproach against me that sticks. And the moment that they do, I have to repent before everybody over that. I have to do everything I can to make that right. And if I can't make that right, and I can't deal with that, then I'm disqualified from ministry. And I am disqualified from ministry, rebuked in the presence of all, so that others will fear to make the same mistake that I made. Whoa, that's heavy. I actually talked to, again, I was talking to a pastor earlier, and I told him that same thing. I said, I've had people who've asked me to be an elder for their church. Had people who asked me to be an overseer for the church. My answer is no. I don't want to be an elder or an overseer for the church, right? I'm not ready to carry it with enough humility. As much as I love the church, I was a pastor in the church for a long time. I don't want that. That is a heavy, heavy responsibility, right? And I don't want that in that season. I don't, right? So again, when we get a good view of what this is like, the authority and the titles, they should bring humility to the top. And when they don't, it's a reminder, whoops, no harm, no foul. We made a mistake. That person's not ready yet. Okay. And unfortunately in the church, we've not normalized calling pastors and leaders and elders out and saying, you know what? That was our fault. We thought you were ready. You were not ready. Let's try this again. We're going to have to remove you for a little bit. You're just not ready. Here's the fruit. Here's the thistles. That's not good. That's not okay. We'll work to give you another shot at some point if we can. But hey, if we did that early, how much spiritual abuse could we mitigate? How much of this could we avoid because people would understand, whoa, there's got to be a greater level of humility. Do I want that? And if I want that, then I've got to learn that humility and I've got to learn that servant heart before I can actually step into authority again. So anyway, I love this clip from Tim Ross on his podcast. I wish more pastors would have this conversation, but guys, I hope that this has encouraged you. Volunteer, serve, be a part of your local church. The body of Christ needs you to bring your gift. The body of Christ needs you to be its best. At the same time, when you can't, God can. When you rest, God still will. Okay. When you have to take a week off, or you have to say no, or you have a season where you're just trying to hold things together, it's okay. God can handle that. You are not letting him down. So I hope that this conversation, I hope that this video, I hope it leaves you with this. I hope it leaves you more excited than ever to serve. I hope it leaves you wanting to serve and use your gifts more than ever in the church, but also walking light and free and abundantly and full of the encouragement and confidence that in seasons or weeks or months when I need to just say, hey, I need to take a break, that God is big enough for that too. And that it removes all that guilt and all that shame. And man, if we could build that kind of environment across the church, across the body of Christ again, I think we would return more to that early church in Acts where everybody was excited to come in and bring their gift. And everybody brought their gift in most weeks because, man, we appreciate the part we play without getting burnt out and without feeling like, man, the church and whether people meet with Jesus hinges on us, because it doesn't. God is big enough to handle it when we can't, but he's gracious enough and he's loving enough to use us and to give us gifts anytime, every time that we show up to the table. So anyway, I hope that you enjoy serving more than ever this week. And I hope that you're a part of a church that gets this. I hope you're a part of a church where it's encouraging to serve. But if not, and you see these red flags, I'm praying for you. And I'm praying that God gives you the wisdom to start these conversations, spark these conversations in a healthy way. You're not after anybody. You're not trying to make anybody feel bad. You're just trying to have conversations and be honest enough with your pastor and your leader and other volunteers to say, you know what, that made me feel a little guilty when you said that. And I don't think that's the way God wants us to feel when we're serving. Let's talk about that. So again, I am praying for you. I'm praying for churches and pastors. I'm praying for you because I know it feels heavy. And sometimes you feel like you don't have enough volunteers to do it. God will bring you what you need. And even worship pastor, somebody I'm sure is listening as a worship pastor, and you're thinking, I don't have enough volunteers for this weekend, Jeff. This is all great. This is all good, but I don't have enough volunteers this weekend. I don't have enough volunteers for the band. What am I going to do? I just want to give you encouragement. If you don't have enough volunteers this weekend for the band, worship pastor, it's okay. If somebody gets up and plays an acoustic guitar or somebody gets up and plays a piano, that's good enough worship for the Lord. God will give us what we need. Sometimes we need to give ourselves permission to not always do the big thing because God's provided what we need. If we don't have the band, maybe that means that what we need this weekend is no band. So church staff, I want to encourage you too. We can do this. A healthy church, a church where people don't feel guilty when they have to say no. I believe that's a church where people volunteer. They bring their gifts. They bring their best. And that church, I believe, is going to thrive. I'm praying that for you. I'm praying that for your church. That's it for this one. We'll be back in another one soon. But until then, grace and peace. All right. That's it for that segment. I'll jump into a couple of comments and I'm going to probably miss some of them, but I'll see if we got any others that we need to hit before we leave. Linda says, people need to be free to serve God as God wants them and to please God and not man. If we're being manipulated, then it could be to please a person and not God. I completely agree, friend. I think you're spot on with that one. Again, the moment, like even First John talks about it. It talks about, understanding the love of Christ, that true love is we follow his commands and they're not burdensome, right? Part of following his commands, part of that is serving and using our gifts, right? It shouldn't be burdensome. When it's burdensome, there's likely a problem. And again, that problem isn't always with the church. Sometimes that problem is with us. Let me see. Susie says, you're really making me appreciate my local gathering. They try to get enough volunteers so people are only working for just a few hours a month. That's awesome. That is that's not what I see as like the predominant way that it's approached, but it's so good, so life-giving, so healthy. So Susie, I'm glad that you're in that church, and I'm glad that this is encouraging you about your church as well. I really do. I think over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see a lot more churches that are doing those things. A lot of churches that are willing to scale back and realizing that, hey, we may want to do all these programs, but if God has not given us enough volunteers to do these programs without burning them out, that may be God telling us no to the program, right? Sometimes we get this idea and it's almost like we get an idea of something that will be good for God. So then we pray that God would breathe life on our vision instead of asking, God, I've got an idea. Do you like this idea, right? Because again, if you don't have enough volunteers at the church without burning people out, you don't have enough volunteers to do it. I think it's a very clear way to hear. I think God is saying either no or God is saying not yet, because we'll have enough volunteers to do this when God is ready without burning people out. That's something that I wish I had learned earlier as a pastor. Lucy says, don't feel guilty passing on children's ministry on Sunday mornings. And then she says, to be honest, a lot of times it's barely a Bible class, a craft that goes with the passage, and then play. Not my Sunday school growing up where we had to memorize verses. Yeah, we need people to be with the kids. Okay. Sometimes we treat it like it's something even bigger than it is. The kids need a safe place to be around each other, to be in community, and to learn about God. That's what they need. But you know what? If there's not enough people to serve in church, to serve in kids' church, then you can, as a church, you can say, you know what, we don't have enough people. So when we don't have enough people to do that, then we're going to be together in family style worship. Well, if that bothers people, they can serve in children's ministry. If that bothers enough parents, they can serve in children's ministry. Man, what if, because the children are there, it's not like you have to be, you always have to have a specific gifting for all of these things. What if, every parent just served one time? That would cover a lot of it. Sometimes we got to think a little differently about this. And I think it's the same thing with a church. When a church is struggling financially and they're honest enough to say, hey guys, we're not trying to manipulate you. We don't want you to feel any burden, but we did want to let you know, you give as God leads you. Don't feel like you have to give any more. But there's a couple of programs that we're struggling to meet budget. And if we don't start meeting budget soon, we're probably going to cut these programs. Okay. No big deal. If God does not provide that money, then we're just going to take that as a sign He doesn't want us doing this in this season, right? I think if we would say that, people have the opportunity to say, you know what? Do I believe in that program enough that I want to give toward it? Right? Is God putting that in me that I want to give more toward that program so that we can keep having it? I actually think if we would be honest, people would be able to fill in the gaps better than if we're just trying to manipulate them to give or casting it as some sort of special blessing they're going to give. I think it's the same thing with serving. Hey guys, we don't have enough people serving in this area. If that doesn't change soon, then we're probably going to stop doing that area for a little bit and take that as a sign that God wants us to take a break. Well, if people really want that program, they're going to be more willing to serve. I think a big part of this problem is that, again, we have turned we've turned the church into spectators. You come, you sit, you partake. And then if you want to get involved, you volunteer to help a program where other people partake. Instead of how the early church saw it, which is we're all a part of this. We all have a role to play, right? We may not all play that role every week, but we all have a role to play to make this what it is. So I think if our churches became less focused on like worship environments, concert environments, spectator type programs, and we help people take more ownership, right? That we're all a part of the church. We're all needed. We all have gifts to give here, right? We're not just serving this program. I actually think more people would step in and use their gifts. We would be able to have more programs because more people would serve. A lot of this would get better and it would get healthier and it would get safer if people realized we are the church. We don't go to church. Church is not an event we go to. Church is what we are, right? But it's just something it's so countercultural to the Western idea of church right now because it really has become about an event. And I don't know how we fix that. We're not going to fix that overnight, but I think we've got to just continually have conversations about it. All right. Lucy said, read your Bible, pray every day, and you will grow, grow, grow. And when you read your Bible, you're going to realize, read your Bible and you pray, God is going to start speaking things to you. And you're like, I didn't even know that was in there. God, I didn't know that was part of your plan for the church because maybe that's not taught. But yeah, I think falling in love with Scripture. And Marty Solomon and I, if you haven't listened to last week's episode with Marty Solomon, we talked about the Bible and its role in spiritual abuse when it's manipulated. When we fall in love with the Bible and we seek to understand God's heart through Scripture, I think that's one of the best antidotes to spiritual abuse. Because when we understand what it says, man, it is really hard to get duped by people who are manipulating Scripture. Even if they're talented, even if they're well-versed, even if they know it, when we understand what a biblical elder is, it just changes the way we see the church. When we understand what church was in the New Testament originally, it changes the way that we view these things, right? So, yes, I can't agree with that enough, Lucy. Falling in love with Scripture, praying, letting God speak to you. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that God wants us to know and wants us to understand. Unfortunately, sometimes we're all too comfortable just hearing what our church leaders want us to understand instead of seeking God's heart. It's like we're seeking our church leader's heart or our denomination's heart instead of God's heart. And that's not to make you feel guilty or anything else. It's just, I hope that that encourages you. Yeah, man, I want to read the Bible for myself. I want to know what it actually says. You read the Old Testament, you read what it says about tithing, you get done and you're like, God, that's different than probably how I've heard tithing taught. But man, there's a lot of stuff there. I want to ask questions about it. Like, most people don't know that there's 3 separate tithes. Most people don't know that some of the tithes you actually ate. Man, you had like a party, you had like a festival together. I mean, you actually partook. The idea of I'm using money to do something to have fun as my tithe feels sacrilegious to most people. So that's just a good example. So yeah, I hope that that comment, Lucy, was so good, and I hope that kind of back and forth in that conversation just makes you guys want to read scripture more. If you haven't checked out that podcast episode with Marty Solomon, it was so good. Twisted Rose says, the worst part is when you stop volunteering and you never hear from them again. No calls, no check-in, no hanging out. You're dropped like you don't exist. And I'm so sorry, Twisted Rose. That is painful, and I know exactly what that feels like. I've been in situations like that. I'm so sorry. That's a mark of an unhealthy church culture, right? The church, we should care more. When somebody's not there, we're not whole. Part of our body is missing. It's not that, hey, a job wasn't done because you weren't here. It's, no, we're missing something. We're not who we're supposed to be. So when a person stops doing a job, sometimes we care more when a person misses doing their job for a week, volunteering, than we do when they leave the church. And man, I've experienced that before where I felt like I had community when I was volunteering. I felt like I was a part of the church and I was needed and everything else. And in a season where I felt like I was completely forgotten. Or if I wasn't contributing to the bottom line of what you're doing, it's like I all of a sudden don't matter. And that can be very, very painful. Now, at the same time, if you're looking to find more community in church, volunteering is a great way to do that. But you should never feel like you're forgotten or not a part when you stop volunteering. And I'm so sorry that was your experience. That's Life on Hoth knows what that's about too. I agree. That's rough, especially when you're going through something really bad. It can feel like you've just been abandoned, can it? That is so painful. And I know there's not everybody in the comments has experienced this, but I know there's quite a few of you in the chat. You've experienced that. If you have, Twisted Rose, you are definitely not alone. Tracy in the chat on our account, that's the hardest part. I'm praying for you as someone who's experienced the same thing, right? Like, that's Church Disrupted community is full of people who have experienced that same thing. And man, it's also a good reminder for us, as bad as that hurt, as we're a part of churches in the future, as we're a part of gatherings in the future, notice who's there and who's not. And when you see someone who's not there, contact them. If you don't have their number, like, find somebody who does, man. And just let them know, even if it's something as simple as hey, this is Jeff. I got your number from so-and-so. I just wanted to text you and let you know I miss you. I hadn't seen you in a while, and I just want to let you know I was thinking about you and I'm praying for you. That could make someone's day, right? That could be the thing that draws somebody back to the church when they felt like they're forgotten. So, man, for those of us that know what that feels like, I would just encourage you, let's do our part to make sure that that's not somebody else's experience, because God, I've been there. That hurts. Lucy says, if you don't have enough band people to sing a cappella. That's right. We don't have to have a professional band and a professional worship leader. We can worship where we're at. Hey, I love a good band. I love good music. But if God's not providing that, we don't have to manufacture it. And this is something we haven't talked about a lot. We may talk about it on a future stream or podcast. But a lot of churches, they don't have enough volunteers, and they just start paying professional musicians to come in because they feel like they have to have the band. And it's just one of those things to me. If God is not providing, I think it's important that we ask the question, why is God not providing that? And too many times we're trying to force, we're trying to force something. We're trying to force a square peg in a round hole because we think, man, every church has got to have the band, or every church has got to have the lights, or every church has got to have this, that, or the other. And we get so enamored with what other churches are doing that we think we're not church if we don't do that. When the reality is, if God's not providing that, he may be telling you that's not how I want your expression of church to go. So good thought. Let me see. Chrissy says, just tuning in. My previous church was always asking for money. and they have special projects. They never get done. Just asking for above and beyond. It's going in their pockets. That's another big thing, Chrissy. Like when churches are asking for above and beyond offerings, I get it, man. There are needs. But when they're asking for above and beyond offerings for special projects, it is important to ask, are those projects getting done? That's something the religion business talks about in their documentary. They actually have some of the original flyers from Kenneth Copeland with their, I can't even remember what they call it, like some ministry capital of the world or something like that. But they had these flyers for like these 6 things they were going to do with this big giving campaign. And they ended up doing like 2 or 3 of them and never did the others, never apologized, never said anything. That is actually a fairly common occurrence. And it's something we should ask about. Again, if your church says, hey, we're going above and beyond offering, we're going to do this thing. If they don't do it, ask why. And if that becomes a pattern, then not only have conversations, but it may also be important enough to say, hey, I'm not giving above and beyond this time because you guys have said multiple times, God is calling us to do this and you didn't do it. Okay. So I think it's important for us to understand, is God really calling us to do this before we ask people to sacrifice for it? Okay. And if it's just a hope and you say, hey, if we get enough money, we'll do it. And if we don't, we won't. Tell us that. Right. I think that's important. I was a part of a church that did a special offering at the end of every year. And after about 5 years, they just stopped even telling people what it was for. It was just for ministry and expansion, because for so many years in a row, they had actually not done the thing they said they were going to do it for. I don't think that's the right answer, but I think that's a better answer than just continuing to ask people for money and then not spending it the way that they said they would. And then Life on Hoth says, dude, many will not know this is coming because relatively few people leave a fellowship for some reason. You're right. Just a message about showing you care is a very good thing. And guys, that'll be where we end it today. I appreciate that comment, Life on Hoth. Sometimes we get so focused on, and I do, this is big, systemically, how can we stop spiritual abuse? How can we stop spiritual abuse when we recognize red flags? How can we hold leaders accountable? All of that. But it's important that we don't just focus on systems and leaders, but we also focus on ourselves. There are a lot of little things that we can do to help people walk in healing. There's a lot of little things that we can do on our own to help people avoid trauma. To help, someone can be through an experience. 2 people can have the same experience. One is traumatized by it, one is not. We can help those people who would be traumatized to not. So it's not all systems, it's not all leaders. The systems, not negotiable. We got to deal with them. Holding leaders accountable, we got to do it. Absolutely. But also you and I as the church, again, it's this idea, the reminder, we don't go to church, we are the church. There are a lot of things that we can do. So I think that's just a good example. Life on Hoth, talked about it. We talked about it for a good couple of minutes, just a little while ago. But it's, hey, when I've experienced religious trauma, when I've experienced deep church hurt, what can I learn from that? And out of that, when I'm ready to step back into the church, when I'm ready to step back into a local gathering, what can I do to help make sure that someone else doesn't go through that same pain? Okay. Sometimes the systems are going to be messed up and I can't fix it. Sometimes the leaders aren't going to want to be held accountable. But while I'm in that gathering, I can do something as simple as saying, you know what? I got dropped like I was hot. And I felt like I totally lost my community. So I can reach out to people and let them know they're loved and seen and valued. And maybe I have to leave the church because the rest of the church isn't going to do that. But while I'm a part of that gathering, I'm going to be as much of a solution as I can be. I think it's just a good reminder. Again, we play a role, and there's all kinds of little things we can do that actually have huge, huge impact. So, man, we're praying for the systems to change. We're fighting for reform. We're praying for leaders, and we're trying to bring more accountability and more transparency. But also, let's just make sure that we never lose sight of the things that we can do day in, day out, week in, week out to fight and contend for the church that Jesus has called us to be. And we'll end on that because we all have a role to play. So let's go and let's play that role.